Chapter 335. As the soul wood in Nank's hand began to glow once more, the monster tide that had been shocked into silence by the birth of myriad swords began to rage once more. In the depths of the monster tide, that massive figure remained as stable as a mountain. It was a monster bull, the legendary monster bull. The reason the word legend was used was because in the records of the Taoist canon, this kind of demon beast had been completely exterminated by the human race and the devil race countless years ago, and it was also because this kind of demon beast was extremely formidable that it had already become a sort of legend. The monster bull possessed the powerful battle prowess of an upper-level star condensation cultivator. Although its spiritual sense was not developed and it did not possess true intelligence, so it could not be completely equivalent to an upper-level star condensation human expert. In the forests and wastelands it lived in, it definitely possessed the same level of lethality as a human expert of the same level, perhaps even stronger. This was because it was an extremely rare monster that excelled in long-range attack. The monster bull's body was as massive as a mountain, its body naturally covered in a layer of extremely hard armor. The tip of its single horn could pierce through solid stone. Its greatest characteristic, and also its most frightening aspect, was its slender tail, covered in black hair. When it crouched, its slender tail would coil into a pile on the ground, but when it encountered an enemy or prey, that slender tail would stand up, wrapping around the single horn on its head and transforming into a bowstring. Its body would transform into a massive bow. This was a very mystical matter, but even more incomprehensible was that the arrows used by this massive bow, which was as large as a mountain, were actually those tiny hairs on its tail. It was also unknown just what these black hairs were made of. On the body of the monster bull, they were as soft as cotton, but once they were shot out by the tail, they became as hard as steel. They were as fast as lightning and simply impossible to dodge. The battle prowess of an upper-level star condensation cultivator, coupled with such strange and difficult to defend against attacks, in the process of the humans and demons conquering the continent, countless experts had been killed by this terrifying monster. The monster bull's reputation spread far and wide, to the point where some people began to suspect that its body contained the blood of the unicorn. Of course, this conjecture did not receive too much approval. Who knew how many single-horned monsters lived in the depths of the continent's cloud mountains? How could such a pure and wholly divine creature like the unicorn leave behind such bloodthirsty descendants? As he watched those monster bulls slowly straighten their massive bodies in the monster tide that were like mountain peaks protruding from the ground, Chern Chongqing's hand, gripping the demon commander's banner sword, felt rather cold. Even from dozens of miles away, he seemed to be able to see the eyes of this demonic beast. It was a pair of eyes that were as small as a grain of rice, emitting a faint, eerie light, making it look especially terrifying. This was just a feeling, but he was very sure that this demonic beast could see his eyes. Otherwise, how could it threaten him from so far away? Chern Chongqing knew that this terrifying monster would soon launch an endless stream of long-range attacks at him, but before dealing with those filament arrows that contained an infinite amount of power, he still had to solve many other problems, such as the indistinct chirping sound that came from the front of the Divine Avenue, as well as the thunderous rumbling sounds that came from within the monster tide. The chirping sound was very weak. If one didn't know how terrifying the owner of the voice was, they might even think it was cute. Chern Chongqing remembered very clearly that in the Four Seas scroll of the Taoist canon, there was a powerful demonic beast that was called by this name. This demonic beast was called the Earth Monkey. Its body was thin and small, its fur an earthy yellow, its fangs and neck extremely long. It could stand like a human, and when it ran, its four limbs were on the ground, making it incredibly fast. Moreover, its fangs and claws were incomparably sharp and could be said to be indestructible. It had an extremely bloodthirsty and cruel temperament, loving to eat humans the most. Most frightening of all was that this demonic beast was extremely skilled at moving underground, almost as miraculous as moving through the earth. Its movements were extremely difficult to track. Even opponents much stronger than it would often be caught off guard, successfully ambushed by it and then devoured to death, a gruesome sight to behold. What made him most wary and uneasy was still the sound of thunder from within the sea of the monster tide. The sound of thunder came from the ground of the grassland splitting open, not from the invasion of sword intent, but from an incomparably powerful demonic beast tearing open the ground and angrily roaring. He looked at that terrifying mountainous figure in the monster tide and knew that this demonic beast had not completely stood up, but was bent over in search of a weapon. The weapon could be a mountain, or it could be those hard rocks beneath the soft earth. The larger and heavier the rock, the easier it was to use. This demonic beast was called the mountain-toppling fiend. It was 28 zhang tall, had a long mouth and coiled horns, and possessed unimaginable brute strength. When it was enraged, it could even topple a mountain, then use the mountain as a weapon, the crushed stones as stars, and the winds it breathed were like blades. It was incomparably valiant. It was ranked third on the ranking of earthly beasts of the Pavilion of Divination. The monster bull, the earth monkey, the mountain-toppling fiend were all names that had the qualifications to enter the Taoist canon. They were all extremely powerful and terrifying demonic beasts. They had already become legends, or perhaps forgotten by people. However, who could have imagined that in this day and age when the continent was ruled by the humans and demons, they would still be seen in the grassland of the Garden of Zhou? The laws of the world of the Garden of Zhou had a compulsory requirement for the cultivation of humans, but it did not seem to affect these demonic beasts. It was no wonder that in the past several hundred years, all the human cultivators and demons that had entered the plains of the unsetting sun had no way of leaving. They had probably already become food for these terrifying demonic beasts. A black hair flew over from the horizon, almost causing the demon commander's banner sword in Qin Chongqing's hand to fall. The chirping sounds near the mausoleum and the rumbling of thunder in the distant grassland entered his ears, causing his face to become abnormally pale. In just an instant, he felt that death had arrived. Previously, because of the shadow, these high-ranked demonic beasts had always remained silent. Now that the 10,000 swords were in the air and Nank was dancing in the rain, they were no longer silent. As a result, 3 unimaginably powerful chis began to spread out in front of the mausoleum, and then they became more and more violent. Qin Chongqing was only at the upper level of ethereal opening. Even if there were 10,000 broken swords by his side, it would not change this fact. These 3 monsters at the upper level of star condensation, whether in terms of cultivation or strength, were all oppressive. It was even somewhat difficult for him to resist the pressure of these 3 monsters. What should he do? Now that he thought about it, they had come all the way from the edge of the grassland to the mausoleum of Zhou. If Nank had not used the soul wood to order those monsters not to attack in order to follow them, perhaps they would have already died on the road. As for why Nank did not let those monsters lead the way, they had some sort of conjecture. These demonic beasts don't necessarily listen to you completely. Qin Chongqing looked at the huge shadow in the sky and imagined the legendary monster that was already half a step into the divine domain behind the shadow. After a moment of silence, he looked at Nank and said, "The remnant rain fell from the shattered clouds in the sky, dripping." Nank closed her eyes, her black hair wildly dancing behind her petite body. The soul wood floated in front of her, growing brighter and brighter, as if it was about to become transparent. She did not pay attention to his words, or perhaps she did not hear them at all. The monster tide continued to sweep towards the mausoleum. The nearby grassland that had just been dyed blood red was very quickly covered by a black sea once more. The sinister chittering grew weaker and weaker. This did not mean that the terrifying earth monkey had already left. On the contrary, it meant that it was preparing to attack. The mountain-toppling fiend finally found a stone protrusion that was several zhang long in the pool of water in the grassland. It stood up, and as a result, a hill appeared in the monster tide. Behind the Black Sea, the monster bull silently gazed at the mausoleum. Its eyes, which were the size of grains of rice, emitted a dim light that fell on Chern Chongsheng's body. Its thin tail curled around the single horn on its head. It was extremely taut, and at least several thousand black bristles were densely arranged on its surface. Chern Chongsheng could not defeat these 3 high-level monsters, but he was not afraid. His eyes were still bright, like the brightest speck of light among the 10,000 broken swords in the sky around the mausoleum. Around the mausoleum, a cold wind blew and the 10,000 swords hummed. In the distance, the monster tide was like a sea, and the great beasts were like mountains. The mountain sea sword flew back in front of him, trembling slightly. Both movement and silence were incompatible. The sword beasts would eventually fight. If these broken swords acted on their own and fought with the monster tide, they would probably fall very quickly and perish. But now, he was here. The 10,000 swords were an army. They were either the soldiers, the vanguard, or the center of the formation. He was the general. How should he lead the 10,000 swords in this battle? He did not know. Even though he had read the Taoist canon since he was a child and had memorized the countless secret cultivation manuals stored away in the Orthodox Academy, it was still impossible for him to learn 10,000 sword styles. No one could do this. Then, how should he control these 10,000 swords and have them display their greatest power? He gripped the yellow paper umbrella and felt the information transmitted by the sword intent. Entering the grassland, coming to the mausoleum of Zhou, and the appearance of the sword pool, everything was related to that sword intent. Perhaps that was the answer. He sensed the pride and steadiness of the sword intent. Pride and steadiness were 2 completely different emotions, even vaguely conflicting. It was basically impossible for them to appear on the same sword or the same person at the same time. Strangely, Chern Chongsheng felt that the mixture of pride and steadiness in the sword intent was very familiar to him. It was not the kind of familiarity that came from reciting the Taoist canon backwards, but a true familiarity. He had seen it with his eyes, felt it with his heart, and even fought with it. It was very simple for him to understand. This was the sword intent of Mountly. He had once felt it on the bodies of those young geniuses of Mountly. Guan Feibai was arrogant and conceited to the point of being cold, Go Hanshi was calm and gentle to the point of being amiable, Liang Banhu was taciturn to the point of being trustworthy, and Qi Jian possessed all 3. As it turned out, this sword intent came from Mountly. He silently gazed at the yellow paper umbrella in his hand. Even now, he still did not know that this sword intent belonged to the legendary Heaven Shrouding Sword, but he knew what he had to do. Even if Zhou Dufu came back to life, he would not be able to use 10,000 sword intents to control 10,000 broken swords and use 10,000 sword styles, much less him. However, he could use this sword intent from Mountly to control 10,000 broken swords and use the 10,000 sword styles of Mountly. The only problem he needed to solve was how to simultaneously control 10,000 strands of spiritual sense. He only needed to solve one problem, and that problem would often be the most difficult problem to solve. Even the metaphysicians of the Li Palace, who were the most imaginative, would not believe that there was a person who could divide the spiritual sense into 10,000 strands. There was no need to even try, but Chern Chongsheng wanted to try. His left hand gripped the handle of the yellow paper umbrella, and his spiritual sense moved quickly, controlling the sword intent in the umbrella to disperse into the sky around the mausoleum. In an instant it came into contact with those broken swords, and he could clearly feel the remaining sword intents in those broken swords. Those sword intents were already exhausted or weak, and some sword intents were even so faint that they were hard to detect. He respectfully and firmly requested those sword intents to temporarily give up their positions and hand over control. The tyrannical mountain sea sword agreed. The reserved temple sword agreed. The 10,000 swords in the sky around the mausoleum all agreed. There was still one more chapter. Chapter 336. All the swords agreed, including the sword that flew the highest in the sky in front of the mausoleum. It was the brightest sword that was so dazzling that it was also the proudest. It did not object, but that sword trembled and hummed. It seemed to be somewhat contemptuous of the sword intent that had entered its body, and did not care about its origins at all. Right now, the Mountly sword intent had already connected the 10,000 swords. What he needed to do was use this sword intent to make the 10,000 swords display sword move. Since it was the Mountly sword intent, he obviously had to display the Mountly sword style, because of his engagement with Su Yurong and the many things that had happened in the capital. In the eyes of many people, the Orthodox Academy and the Mountly sword sect, as well as him and the Divine State's 7 laws represented by Qiushanjun, had an unresolvable grudge. However, what was interesting was that what he knew the most was the Mountly sword style. This was because the secrets of the Mountly sword style had always been by his side, and also because ever since he started cultivating, the genius opponents he encountered all came from Mountly. The Mountly sword sect was the sword that guarded the mountain of the southern sections. They had cultivated the path of the sword for generations, and had created countless sword styles since ancient times. There were over 30,000 sword moves that had the qualifications to be recorded in the secrets of the Mountly sword style, and he had already firmly memorized them in his mind. Of course, it was impossible for him to completely grasp the sword intents needed for those sword moves in a short year, but now, with the assistance of the Mountly sword intent in the yellow paper umbrella, he had no problems using the Mountly sword style. The greatest problem was still his spiritual sense. How many strands of his spiritual sense could he split into? How many swords could he control to use the Mountly sword style? In the sky that had just cleared up after the rain, Nank closed her eyes. Her small face was pale, and her black hair danced in the wind. The soul wood glowed brightly, urging the monsters to attack the mausoleum. At the same time, she was preparing for the final attack. Looking at her and the black sea of monsters behind her, as well as the 2 terrifying beasts that were like mountains, Chen Chongqing also closed his eyes. The 30,000 sword moves in the secrets of the Mountly sword style, with an incomprehensible speed, seemed to become real images, constantly flashing through his sea of consciousness. Around the mausoleum there was a series of faint scraping sounds, and then he could faintly hear squeaking sound. Sometimes it was to the east, sometimes it was to the west, and in an instant it was several li away. It was impossible to determine the location, so it was naturally even more impossible to attack. The sinister and powerful earth monkey had come. Chen Chongqing's eyes were still closed, but he suddenly raised his right arm and pointed towards a certain direction on the Divine Avenue. Following the direction of his finger, the sky in front of the mausoleum resounded with a concentrated and extremely sharp whistle of swords. 100 swords pierced through the air, touching the willow and longing for its return. The 18 bends of the mountain road, falling stream, in front of Mount Tide Horse. These sword techniques were the mountain gate swords of the Mountly sword sect. From the first style to the last style, these 100 swords actually used 100 sword moves. This was equivalent to 100 Mountly sword sect disciples simultaneously unleashing their sword technique. Logically speaking, Chen Chongqing's true essence shouldn't be this abundant, but it shouldn't be forgotten that these swords were burning their own lives. This was their final battle. With his current level of cultivation and the extremely powerful heaven-shrouding sword intent, the power of these 100 swords was not something a normal Mountly sword sect disciple could compare to. It was the level of an inner disciple of Mountly sword sect, or even the Divine State's 7 laws. 100 Liang Banhu, 100 Qi Jians, or in other words, 100 Guan Fei Bais attacking at the same time. What kind of power would it have? Even a peak star condensation expert would not be able to directly resist its edge, So what about an upper-level star condensation monster? The sword glows crisscrossed in front of the divine avenue, swift and fierce, penetrating deeply into the ground in front of the divine avenue. A mountain gate formed from sword glows stood towering in front of the divine avenue. This mountain gate was majestic and magnificent, solemn and divine, as if it came from Mount Lee. A roar filled with anger and frustration resounded from underground. Immediately after, the ground roiled and split open. The earth monkey turned into a stream of light with a trail of black blood, rushing towards the periphery of the mausoleum with all its might. It had actually been heavily injured in a single move. The 100 swords did not pursue. They slowly drifted up and down in the sky in front of the divine avenue. The mountain gate was faintly discernible, as if it was in the clouds. If there were clouds, there would be moisture. The dark clouds that had been sliced apart by the sword intent slowly drew closer, following the will of nature. Rain once again fell from the sky, although it was much finer. Nank's eyes were closed, and the rain drenched her pale face. The zither-playing old man collapsed on the divine avenue, covered in blood. He was already dead. Ning Chui had fainted, and Hua Qiu had also fainted. Only the powerful demon general couple were still standing. They held a bent metal rod and a broken iron pot, standing below Nank, protecting her. Looking at the mountain gate formed from the 100 swords on the divine avenue, the couple's expressions were grave. With the arrival of the 100 swords, a terrifying upper-level star condensation monster was instantly injured. Let alone the fact that their cultivation was suppressed to the upper level of ethereal opening, even if they recovered their powerful battle prowess from outside the Garden of Zhou, would they be able to withstand this round of berserk sword attacks? What shocked and confused them the most was how could Chen Chongqing's spiritual sense be so powerful? It could actually split into 100 strands, and use 100 swords to use 100 sword techniques. Had something like this ever happened on this continent before? The soul wood in front of Nank grew brighter and brighter. The shadow in the sky grew lower and lower, gradually descending below her. The monster tide that was like a black ocean finally arrived around the mausoleum. It spread upwards and began to attack. Countless monsters howled and bellowed. They leapt onto the huge rocks of the mausoleum and quickly climbed upward. In a very short amount of time, the lower half of the mausoleum was submerged by the monster tide. It was a scene of chaos. The squeezed monsters constantly surged about, and it seemed rather disgusting. The mausoleum was just too big, and the number of monsters was just too many. They were everywhere. The 100 swords on the divine avenue unceasingly slashed and killed, just like a Real mountain gate, but it could not stop the advancement of the monster tide. Chen Chongqing still needed even more swords, and those swords were in the sky around the mausoleum. Standing at the edge of the stone platform in the drizzle, his face became somewhat pale. His eyes were tightly closed, and his eyelashes trembled slightly. Countless moves of the Mount Lee sword style were constantly flashing through his sea of consciousness. His spiritual sense and the strand of sword intent passed through the yellow paper umbrella and landed on the bodies of all the sword. 10,000 strands of spiritual sense, 10,000 swords. 10,000 sword glows, 10,000 howls. Countless mournful howls of swords resounded in the surroundings of the mausoleum, instantly suppressing the violent roars of the monster tide and occupying the entire plains of the unsetting sun. Countless swords flew through the air, killing towards the monster tide. The drizzle could not cover up the setting sun at the edge of the plains. The ball of light that did not seem to have any temperature emitted a warm red light that landed on the bodies of those swords. Those swords seemed like they were about to ignite. They danced around the mausoleum, passing through it like golden crows. Golden crows returned to Mount Lee. This was a sword move. An extremely powerful sword move. Swish, 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 swish. Countless concentrated sounds of slicing rang out. Several hundred monsters on the southwest side of the mausoleum were chopped in half by the golden rain of swords. several dozen swords scattered in the sky to the north of the mausoleum. The sword energy they left behind was like a flower blooming in full bloom. Flourishing flowers. This was still a sword move. On the ground of the plains, countless deep sword slashes appeared in an instant. The dozen or so flood serpents that were currently surging towards the mausoleum were sliced apart inch by inch. The lump of flesh constantly twitched in the tainted blood. There were also countless swords violently piercing through, fighting against the sharp claws and teeth of the monsters. The blood of the monsters mixed with the luster of the swords, spraying this world. Under the afterglow of the setting sun, the cries of swords resounded in the sea of grass. The mausoleum was like a huge fishing boat. 3 chants of the fisherman's song. This was still the Mountly sword style. Qin Chongqing's face became paler and paler, and his body trembled more and more violently. However, he held the yellow paper umbrella and stood in the drizzle. He did not fall from beginning to end. As a result, those swords continued to fight. Several hundred swords arrived in front of the mountain-toppling fiend that was like a mountain. The mountain-toppling fiend let out an angry howl. The stone pillar in its hand, with an unimaginable power, smashed towards the rain of swords. An explosive roar resounded through the plains. The rain of swords fell slightly, then reformed once again and charged towards the mountain-toppling fiend. Mountain spirit splits the cliff. Star hook traversing the day. Dew flower leaves stalwart. These were the 3 moves that Qi Jian had used consecutively in the battle against Tang 36 in the Ivy League gathering under Go Hanshi's command. Today, Qin Chongqing had used them to deal with this terrifying monster. On the mountain-like body of the mountain-toppling fiend, several hundred clear sword slashes appeared. Looking at this scene, looking at the countless scenes around the mausoleum, the grave expressions on the faces of Ting Xiaoming and Lu Wan had already disappeared. All that remained was a patch of paleness. On the battlefield of the snowy plains, it was unknown how many experts of the human army they had seen. They had seen even more shocking scenes. Today, in front of the mausoleum of Zhou, they had also seen far too many miraculous things. But at this moment, they were still shocked speechless. Ting Xiaoming's expression was slightly perplexed. Looking at Qin Chongqing in the rain, he muttered, how is this possible? Tired. I'll have to trouble everyone to vote for free golden keyboard works and recommendation tickets. Everyone has worked hard. See you tomorrow. Chapter 337. Simultaneously controlling 10,000 swords required 10,000 strands of divine sense. Who could possess such a powerful divine sense? Even if Zhou Dufu were to come back to life, he would probably still not be able to do it, but Qin Chongqing just so happened to be able to do it. As a result, Ting Xiaoming was even more perplexed than shocked. He could not understand this matter. Back then, when he was determining his fated star in the library of the Orthodox Academy, Qin Chongqing's divine sense had dispersed into the night sky above the capital. The divine empress had observed the stars and made such an evaluation. The strength of this person's divine sense and the tranquility of his consciousness were extremely rare. He was probably an old scholar who had bitterly studied for 100 years and suddenly comprehended the truths of the world, thus obtaining such good fortune. He was just like Wang Ji-su back then, accumulating his strength for a long time, so he was naturally extraordinary. In this evaluation, the Divine Empress had compared Qin Chongqing to Wang Ji-su, who had comprehended the way in one night and the stars illuminated the night. From this, it could be imagined just how strong Qin Chongqing's divine sense was, but no matter how strong it was, it could not be stronger than Wang Ji-su's. The reason why he was able to divide his divine sense into 10,000 strands was mainly because of the latter part of the Divine Empress evaluation. The number of strands a divine sense could divide had nothing to do with the strength of the divine sense itself. It was only related to the stability of the divine sense. A peerless expert like Zhou Dufu naturally possessed a divine sense that was countless times stronger than Qin Chongqing's. That sort of divine sense was like a hard and massive rock. It could be divided into 1, 2, or even several dozen strands, but in the end it could not be divided forever. There would always be a time when it would turn into tiny gravel, and there would be no way to divide it into even smaller gravel. Chen Chongqing's divine sense was incomparably serene. Although it could not be as indestructible as an expert at Zhou Dufu's level, it was even softer. It was not like a hard rock, but like water. It could be divided into countless droplets, turning into droplets, turning into mist, as if it could be divided endlessly. Countless swords shuttled back and forth around the mausoleum. From time to time, they would fall into the monster tide, bringing forth a rain of blood. Perhaps they would encounter an extremely tough resistance, and some of the old and dilapidated swords would be broken once again. It was a rather tragic sight to behold. When the 10,000 swords had just begun their battle with the monster tide, several dozen of the fastest and most well-preserved swords, under the guidance of the mountain sea sword and under the guidance of Chen Chongqing's spiritual sense, flew towards the depths of the grassland with a focused and resolute manner. At this moment, they finally arrived before the monster bull. The monster bull's eyes, which were like grains of rice, emitted a cruel and dim light. Its slender tail, which was tightly connected to its horn, was stretched taut. The surrounding grass had long been flattened by the berserk aura exuding from its body. Only countless densely packed and light hissing sounds could be heard in the air. The several thousand black hairs on its tail transformed into almost invisible arrows, shooting towards the mausoleum. Dang 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 dang! A series of crisp, crashing sounds rang out from the depths of the grassland. The sounds seemed to be squeezed together into one long note. Several dozen sword glows danced through the air severally in front of the monster bull like bolts of lightning. The sword energies melded together, drawing out countless circles of light in the air. The several thousand black hairs shot out by the monster bull were all blocked by the sword glows. In the blink of an eye, several thousand extremely small white vortexes of qi appeared in the air. They were the result of the swords meeting the black hairs. Many cracks like lines appeared on the ground of the grassland. Those catfish and loaches that were lucky enough to survive did not even have the time to burrow into the depths of the mud before they were torn to shreds. The mountain sea sword did not block the black hairs that shot towards the mausoleum from several dozen li away. It violently charged out of the circle of swords. The heavy black iron blade cut through the air, giving off an ear-aching whistle. It directly chopped down at the monster bull's single horn from above. It was the move that Su Li had created, the scorching heaven sword. The grassland was filled with the sounds of the edge of the sword cutting through the tough hide. Everywhere, one could see chunks of flesh flying. Countless sword glows gradually dimmed, and countless monsters collapsed at the foot of the mausoleum or in the depths of the aquatic plants. The drizzle around the mausoleum still continued to fall. When would this rain of swords in the grassland stop? Nank still had her eyes closed. The soul wood in front of her grew brighter and brighter. The light was as white as milk, and her small face became even paler. Ting Xiaoming and Lu Wan'er stood guard for her, exuding a powerful and resolute qi. They did not allow a single sword to approach her body. After an unknown amount of time, she finally opened her eyes. The drizzle fell on her face, but the dark green flames in the depths of her indifferent and emotionless eyes were not extinguished by the cold rain. Instead, for some reason, a divine golden light appeared at the edge of her eyes, and the golden edge was currently corroding the depths of the green. Chen Chongqing also opened his eyes and looked at her who was floating in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. The two of them quietly looked at each other, saying nothing. Nank viewed herself as the successor of the Garden of Zhou. Her methods originated from the restrictions that Zhou Dufu had left behind. Those restrictions had already kept the 10,000 broken swords in the Garden of Zhou for several hundred years. Today, Chen Chongqing wanted to rely on the 10,000 broken swords and leave with them. This would inevitably destroy the very foundation of the Garden of Zhou. This was something that she could not allow. As a result, even if she had to take the risk of being killed by the 10,000 swords, she still wanted to mentally travel through the world and use her strongest method to kill Chen Chongqing and collect the 10,000 swords, allowing the grassland to return to peace. Chen Chongqing obviously would not accept this arrangement, whether it was the arrangement of fate or the arrangement that Zhou Dufu had made before his death. The battle between the 10,000 swords and the monster tide continued. In the short moment that they looked at each other, it was unknown just how many bitter and bloody scenes had occurred. The two sides of this battle were swords and beasts. There were no people, so naturally no one spoke. There were only the whistling of swords and the roars of beasts. There were no shouts of killing, but the killing intent on the grassland soared. Not long after, the monster tide gradually calmed down, then slowly retreated towards the periphery of the mausoleum. It was unknown whether it was because they had discovered that they could not break through the 10,000 broken swords outside the mausoleum, or because Nank had issued an order through the Soul Wood, or because they had vaguely sensed something. Chen Chongqing raised his right hand. The fine rain fell on his hand, and the countless swords in the grassland correspondingly returned. Several tens of thousands of low-level monsters had died. The sinister and strange earth monkey had attempted to launch a sneak attack on Chen Chongqing at the very beginning, but in the end it was successfully countered by Chen Chongqing. It was heavily injured by the mountain gate sword, and one of its hind limbs was severed while the other was crippled. It could no longer stand upright like a human. It hugged the leg of the heaven-fonging beast and stared resentfully at the mausoleum. It let out angry squeaks, as if it was complaining. The mountain-toppling fiend's mountainous body was extremely eye-catching in the sea of monsters. However, its hard body now had at least several thousand sword slashes of varying depths. Some of the swords had successfully broken through its terrifying defense, injuring its flesh and bones. Fresh blood dripped down from the broken stone spear in its hand and dripped onto the ground. The monster bull in the depths of the grassland seemed to have suffered the lightest injuries. However, most of the black hairs on its slender tail had already been shot out, leaving only a few tufts. It looked as if it had been scorched by fire, mottled and mottled. It was in a very sorry and dismal state, yet also somewhat laughable. It was no longer as terrifying as it was before. Countless swords flew back to the mausoleum. Some of the swords had been broken again, leaving behind only a short section other than the hilt. They looked just as dismal, making one's heart ache. Some of the swords had been struck by the monster's venom. The rust had been eaten away, allowing them to regain their luster. However, some of them found it hard to bear, tottering on the verge of collapse along the way. Not a single sword fell into the grassland and fell. This was because just as the swords were about to fall, other swords would fly over and catch them from below. Even those swords that had been broken by the monsters in battle and stepped into the mud were also picked up by other swords from the ground. Several swords met and flew back to the mausoleum. It was very easy for people to associate this scene with a real battlefield. Under the bloody sun, hearing the sound of victory and returning to camp, the injured and exhausted soldiers did not even have the strength to cheer. They supported each other and slowly walked back to the camp. The injured soldiers who were powerless to walk were lifted up by their comrades using simple tree branches. Chen Chongqing did not leave a single sword on the grassland. This seemed rather moving, but Nank would not feel this sort of cheap hot-bloodedness in her eyes. What she saw in this scene was Chen Chongqing's strength. To be able to multitask and persist until now was rarely seen in the world. Even she admired him very much. However, the more she admired him, the more she wanted to die. The dark green flames in the depths of Nank's eyes had already completely turned into a divine gold. An indescribably pure and holy qi exuded from her petite body. At this moment it was very difficult to feel that she was a demon princess, but more like the holy maiden of South Stream Temple. That terrifying shadow had already completely fallen behind her. Behind her was the plains of the unsetting sun. That shadow had once obscured half the sky. Now that it had fallen, it covered the entire grassland. The dim light from the distant setting sun fell on the shadow, but it seemed to be sucked in instantly. Without any refraction, it disappeared without a trace, just like that. At this moment, the grassland was covered in blood. The shadow rose and fell, as if it was coming to life because of the blood. The rays of the setting sun were no longer being devoured. They mixed with the blood and became golden, which was the color of the flames in the depths of Nank's eyes. The edge of the shadow was plated with a golden edge, gradually forming a shape. As it slowly fluttered, the shape became clearer and clearer. It was a pair of wings. A pair of golden wings. This pair of golden wings was incomparably large. It was unknown how many thousands of li long they were, spanning across the world. The golden-winged Great Ping had finally revealed its true appearance. With its appearance, the world changed color. The dark clouds that had just gathered again above the mausoleum instantly dispersed. All the monsters fearfully lowered their heads, one after another descending into the blood, mud, and grass in what they believed to be the most subservient manner. The monster tide stirred up wave after wave. Even the most arrogant and tyrannical mountain-toppling fiend humbly knelt in the shadow of the Great Ping. The setting sun was behind the Great Ping. Countless rays of light flowed along the edges of its wings, transforming into countless specks of light in the sky. This scene was so beautiful that it seemed unreal. It was like a scene from a myth, described in the Taoist canon of the Orthodoxy. In reality, in the Great Hall of Light of the Li Palace, there really was a mural. It depicted the phenomenon of the golden-winged Great Ping being born in the clouds of light in ancient times. From the moment the golden-winged Great Ping was born in the world, it had practically stepped into the divine domain. Whether it was myth, legend, or reality, the golden-winged Great Ping was a divine beast on the same level as the unicorn and the divine sparrow. It was only below the dragon and phoenix. Chen Chongqing gazed at the golden-winged Great Ping that covered the sky and said nothing. From the moment he saw that shadow, he had been waiting for this moment to arrive. However, just like death, no matter how much preparation you made, when it came, you would realize that you were still not prepared. Right now, he felt this way. This golden-winged Great Ping seemed to be death. I have something to do today, so there is only one chapter. Chapter 338. The might of a divine beast on the level of the golden-winged Great Ping was enough to shake the heavens and move the earth. In the period of time that had already passed, as long as it was willing, it could casually flap its wings. Without the 10,000 swords accompanying him, Chen Chongqing would not be able to block it at all. He would definitely die. However, for some reason, it had always turned into a shadow and quietly floated in the sky. It never attacked the mausoleum. Only now, when Nank used some secret technique to send her spiritual sense into the shadow, did the scene before their eyes appear. Perhaps it was as Su Yorong and Chen Chongqing had deduced. Nank, who only had the soul wood but not the soul pivot, could not completely control the monsters in the grassland. At the very least, it was not enough to control a divine beast like the golden-winged Great Ping. As a result, Nank needed such a long time to invite the Great Ping to appear. How could he deal with this terrifying divine beast? With Chen Chongqing's cultivation at the upper level of ethereal opening, if he wanted to do this by himself, it would be no different from a myth. The black dragon was still sleeping in the lake outside his ethereal palace. Even if it woke up now, it would only be a spiritual soul of the black dragon in the Garden of Zhou. It would not be able to deal with a real golden-winged Great Ping. Even with the help of the 10,000 broken swords, he could not see any possibility. After all, he was not as strong as the masters of the swords. At this moment, the pressure of the golden-winged Great Ping fell on the mausoleum along with the rays of light. The 10,000 swords were silent. Although they did not feel fear, this silence clearly indicated that they were not the opponent of the golden-winged Great Ping. Only the mountain sea sword, the temple sword, and a dozen or so other swords that had appeared first had their tips slightly raised. They were silent and fierce, as if they were prepared to attack at any moment. Out of the 10,000 swords, these swords were the strongest and the proudest. One of the swords even began to vibrate at high speeds, constantly humming. The sword trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of excitement. Seeing the terrifying golden-winged great Ping float towards the mausoleum with the 10,000 rays of light, this sword was very excited, impatient to fight it. Chen Chongqing had noticed this sword before. This was because this sword flew the highest and proudest of the 10,000 swords. Even when facing the sword intent of the yellow paper umbrella, it did not have the slightest intention of retreating. At the same time, it was also the brightest, reflecting the rays of light from the edge of the plain. It was like the brightest star in the night sky, and it had the air of a noble. Seeing this sword, Chen Chongqing could very easily associate it with the scene of Luoluo standing in front of the great Ping of the night. This pride was not shown on the outside. The nobility came from the bloodline. Even if the opponent was the golden-winged great Ping of the great Ping, how could it have fear? The sword of the mausoleum of the sky of the Ping. Chen Chongqing extended his hand towards the sky. Through the sword intent of the yellow paper umbrella, he conveyed his thoughts. Afterwards, he returned the sword intent that he had scattered back into the yellow paper umbrella, returning freedom to the sword itself. With it of the sword. SWN of. With Chen of. Of a of. Chen and. Holding the hilt of the sword, Chen Chongqing remembered the history of this sword. When he looked at the golden rock in the dazzling light, his eyes became more determined. This sword was called the Dragoncry sword, and it was extremely powerful. Previously, in his hands, it had heavily wounded Ting Xiaoming in one move. But more importantly, this Dragoncry sword once belonged to a prince of the Zhou dynasty. This prince was called Qin Xuanba, the youngest brother of Emperor Taizong. He had been endowed with extraordinary talent ever since he was a child. At a very young age, he had already cultivated to the peak of star condensation. Even in that great era of blooming wildflowers and the birth of geniuses, he could still be considered a peerless genius, because the blood of the true dragon flowed through his body. In other words, he was the Qiushan Jun of that era. Chen Xuanba had died when he was very young. When he died, the army from Tianliang County had just conquered the capital. The dynasty had not yet changed its name, and the Zhou dynasty had not yet been officially founded. His title of prince was conferred posthumously, but no one had ever questioned it. It had nothing to do with his surname, but rather because the entire continent was clear of the role he had played when the army of Tianliang County swept through the continent. In the past 1,000 years of the imperial family of the Great Zhou, this valiant youth, who had died early, was publicly acknowledged as the strongest. Although he had never fought with his second brother, Emperor Taizong, until his death, no one dared to question this, because he had fought with Zhou Dufu in the Garden of Zhou for a day and a night before dying from exhaustion. Now, because of some complicated reasons, there were very few people who still remembered Chen Xuanba's once incomparably tyrannical name. There were also very few records of him in the official history of the dynasty. However, those who still remembered the history of the past, every time they thought of Chen Xuanba's name and the Dragoncry sword that had once been at his waist, they would feel many complex emotions and sorrow. Because Chen Xuanba had died early, he had not participated in the bloody battle between Emperor Taizong and his brothers over the imperial throne. To that valiant youth who had died early, this could be considered a sort of happiness, but to the Chen imperial clan, it was a great misfortune. This was because if he had still been alive, under the suppression of his powerful martial strength, this battle would not have happened at all. Even if the conflict still existed, perhaps it would not have been so bitter and bloody, ultimately leading to the death of several hundred members of the imperial clan and the capital flowing with rivers of blood. Of course, there was an even more widespread theory. If Chen Xuanba had been able to live to the end, it would have been impossible for Emperor Taizong to ascend to the imperial throne. The records of Tianliang County and the annals of history that had been slowly destroyed clearly stated that Chen Xuanba had clearly been much closer to his elder brother, His Highness Prince Jian. If he had also participated in the battle for the imperial throne, how could Emperor Taizong, draped in his pajamas, have been able to avoid that ambush in the 100-herb garden? Thus, a heart-chilling conspiracy theory appeared. Seeing that the army of Tianliang County was about to capture the capital, that the great Zhou was about to be founded, and that he was about to become a high and lofty prince with an incomparably brilliant future, why did Chen Xuanba take the initiative to enter the garden of Zhou and challenge Zhou Dufu? Yes, in the few existing records, all those who had been involved had written very clearly that this battle between peerless experts had been proposed by Chen Xuanba. Why? According to the annals of the imperial clan, it was precisely because Chen Xuanba saw that the great Zhou was about to be founded and that he no longer had to shoulder the heavy responsibility of his clan that he began to pursue the heavenly Tao. However, this kind of explanation lacked some persuasiveness. Most importantly, he was about to be defeated, so why would he die? Even if Zhou Dufu did not care about the fury of the great Zhou imperial clan, did he not care about Emperor Taizong's feelings? It must be known that Emperor Taizong was Chen Xuanba's second brother, and also Zhou Dufu's sworn brother. The past history could no longer be sorted out. Chen Xuanba had died, Emperor Taizong had also died. Looking at this mausoleum now, it could basically be confirmed that Zhou Dufu had also died. Heroic figures would always be battered by the wind and rain. Only the Dragoncry sword was left in the garden of Zhou to recollect its former glory, still as proud as it was in the past. A young imperial clan, a peerless god of war, the bloodline of the true dragon, this was Chen Xuanba. The Dragoncry sword he used was naturally incomparably noble and full of pride. How could it be afraid of the great Peng? Chen Chongqing looked at the Dragoncry sword and felt the pride that remained in the sword. For some reason, he felt an indescribable closeness. This closeness was hard to explain. It was incomparably strong, and it actually caused his mind to surge, making it difficult for him to control himself. His hand began to tremble, and thus the sword also began to tremble. In the past 2 days, there have been too many matters at home, so there will be fewer updates. It will be better the day after tomorrow. Regarding today's chapter, the brightest star in the night sky, it is obviously talking about Chen Xuanba, the once valiant youth. It is very much in line with my sense of beauty. Moreover, for the story of choosing heaven, these 2,000 words today are extremely important. It is not the main topic, but the antecedent. Chapter 339. The shadow of the golden-winged Great Peng arrived in the sky several hundred li in front of the mausoleum. The edges of its wings radiated with golden light, yet it brought darkness to the mausoleum. Looking at it in the darkness, its 2 eyes were like 2 balls of burning divine fire. Nank's black hair danced in the wind. Her petite body quietly floated between the 2 balls of divine fire. In comparison, she was extremely tiny, but it gave off a feeling that she had already formed an inseverable connection with the golden-winged Great Peng. In other words, she was currently the soul of the golden-winged Great Peng. As the golden light flickered, an unimaginably terrifying pressure fell on the grassland. What followed was a hurricane. Even the most violent wind in the South Sea could not produce so much. The shredded grass danced uneasily in the air, and the dirty water on the ground was shaken to pieces. Not a single monster could stand firm, and they all fell to the ground. The 10,000 broken swords in the air around the mausoleum were constantly blown up and down. They were like countless boats in the ocean, and they could be swallowed by a heaven-shaking wave at any time. With a clear cry that was cold and extremely arrogant, the golden-winged Great Peng flapped its wings and sped up towards the mausoleum. It gave off the feeling that the sky was about to press down on the mausoleum. The golden light at the edges of its wings scattered and then gathered again. It was like a leaping flame, as if it was about to come alive. As a result, the entire grassland began to burn. Whether it was blood or water, they all began to give birth to raging flames. On the burning grassland was a black ocean formed by countless monsters. This black ocean was also burning, turning into a sea of fire. No matter if it was the high-level monsters or the field mice native to the grassland, they all stood in the sea of fire, gazing at the pair of wings in the sky that spanned several hundred li with reverence and piety. They all let out roars that were close to madness. As the golden-winged Great Pung approached, the burning grassland became bright, but the mausoleum in the center of the grassland became even darker. The 10,000 broken swords did their utmost to resist the strong winds brought about by the two huge wings, and they all flew to the front of the mausoleum. The densely packed 10,000 broken swords formed a semicircular sword array in front of the mausoleum. Chen Chongqing stood in the center of the vast sword array. In comparison, he was also extremely tiny, but he was the soul of the sword array. His left hand still held the yellow paper umbrella, but he did not withdraw the sword intent from the golden-winged Great Pung. He knew very well that many of those broken swords were already on the verge of collapse after experiencing the bitter battle with the monster tide. If he withdrew the mountly sword intent, the golden-winged Great Pung would not even need to do anything, and those swords would perish. Right now, he could only use the sword intent of the Dragoncry sword. However, several hundred years had passed. Was the sword intent of this sword still strong enough? He could only use the sword intent of the sword intent of the Dragoncry. However, the Pung of Dragoned 1,000 years later, he, the great pen-winged great saint. This inexplicable intimacy caused his mind to fiercely shake, just like every time Zhixio fell ill. His heartbeat instantly doubled, and the true essence in his meridians became countless times faster. The hand that gripped the hilt of his sword incessantly trembled, shaking more and more violently, to the point that his entire body began to tremble. Even the snowy plain in his body began to tremble. The thick snow that the snowy plain had once borne was the result of several hundred nights of bitter cultivation since he had fixed his fated star in the Orthodox Academy. It was the purest radiance of the stars. In the grand examination and the several dozen days of battle, it had been burned up several times. Now, only a shallow layer remained. The shallow snow was easy to loosen. Following the tremor that came from outside his body, the snowflakes were shaken off the plains and thrown into the air. They met the light refracted by the spherical lake and began to burn with a boom. The fragments of star radiance and snow instantly burned into clear water, then into mist, and finally into the purest true essence. It filled his body, and then flowed along his dried-up or even broken meridians, advancing without stopping. To Chen Chongqing, this was an extremely painful process, but he did not let out a groan. He only stared at the golden-winged Great Pung that was getting closer and closer to the mausoleum. He continued to persevere, letting the tremors continue to burn the snowy plain, and the true essence continue to invade his body. At a certain moment, the strand of true essence finally arrived at his wrist. The tremor that came from his heart and the tremor of the sword hilt met, then fused into one. It became an indescribable battle intent. The Dragoncry sword was already damaged, and the sword intent was not as great as it was in the past, but the battle intent still existed. With this proud and stubborn sword intent, Chen Chongqing held the Dragoncry sword in his hand and pierced towards the golden-winged Great Pung in the sky. A clear and distant dragon cry that was difficult to understand resounded from the stone platform in front of the mausoleum's main entrance. An extremely beautiful and bright sword glow, carrying with it a dragon's breath that was almost real, broke through the distance of several dozen li and arrived in the sky. It slashed towards the space between the two balls of divine fire that were the eyes of the golden-winged Great Pung. Nank was there. Compared to the sword glow of the Dragoncry sword, she was so minuscule, just a little black dot. However, her expression did not change. She extended a finger towards the extremely bright sword glow. Through the connection of the soul wood, she and the golden-winged Great Pung were one. She was the golden-winged Great Pung, possessing a strength and mental strength that was close to the divine domain. She only needed a finger to block the sword glow of the Dragoncry sword. Looking from the plains and the mausoleum, an extremely strange black mass of chi appeared between the eyes of the golden-winged Great Pung. The mass of chi was at the tip of Nank's finger. It was the result of two extremely powerful forces colliding. In the next moment, the black mass of chi instantly disappeared. Faintly, many tiny cracks appeared in the air, which represented that even the real space was showing signs of collapsing. At the same time, a huge sound resounded in the sky above the plains, like a clap of thunder. The gale instantly descended from the sky to the ground, and then to a distance of 1,000 li. The stubborn grass between the cliffs of the mausoleum was completely uprooted into the sky, blown to some unknown place. Even the moss on the cliffs at the bottom had been peeled off, and even the rock on the surface of the cliffs had become somewhat soft. The burning Black Sea in the plains gave birth to a huge tide. Under the eyes of the golden-winged Great Pung that were like divine fire, at least several hundred low-ranked monsters were directly shaken to death. In the sword array in front of the mausoleum, there were also several dozen swords that were tottering. Chen Chongqing did not hear the thunder in the sky, nor did he pay attention to these scenes. He stared at the Dragoncry sword in his hand, because just a moment ago, the Dragoncry sword had emitted an extremely soft sound. It was the sound of breaking. The Dragoncry sword had broken. The upper half of the sword fell into the pool of water in front of him, giving off a soft clap. In Chen Chongqing's ears, this soft clap was the sound of thunder. A bolt of lightning exploded on the stone platform in front of the mausoleum's main entrance. Boom! In the gale, Chen Chongqing's body flew back several dozen zhang, heavily falling on the stone door. Smoke and dust rose slightly. His face was pale and blood surged to his throat, but he swallowed it back down. He felt that all his bones had been broken, but he stood up again. This was because although the Dragoncry sword was already broken, its battle intent was still there. Only, even with such a violent battle intent, even with the support of 10,000 swords, was he still not a match for the golden-winged Great Pung? Chen Chongqing looked at the broken sword, and noticed that the fracture was very neat and very smooth, but it did not seem new. Only then did he remember that when he held the Dragoncry sword before, he could faintly see that there was an indistinct line on the blade of the Dragoncry sword. Only now did he understand that the line was a blade scar. Countless years ago, Chen Xuanba had brought this sword to the garden of Zhou and lost to Zhou Dufu's blade. Although he had died, he was not willing to fall. This sword was clearly broken, but he stubbornly refused to let his opponent see it. Only after countless years, when this proud sword once again faced an equally powerful opponent, was it finally unable to endure it. He gripped the broken sword, and silently and slowly walked back to the edge of the stone platform, gazing at the gloomy sky. He did not know why the golden-winged Great Pung needed to merge with Nank, but it had already proven its strength. Nank had already disappeared. She had truly become one with the Great Pung. The two divine flames were still pure and holy, but also berserk. They coldly stared at his tiny figure in the mausoleum, getting closer and closer. The world changed color and dark clouds roiled. 10,000 bolts of lightning constantly lit up in the sky above the mausoleum like snakes. The Dragoncry sword was already broken, so which sword should he use? The Mountain Sea sword or the Temple sword? Or should he use 10,000 swords at the same time? Just at this moment, he suddenly felt a warm flow appear between his right hand's thumb and forefinger. He still had not put down the Dragoncry sword. This warm flow came from the other half of the Dragoncry sword. This was the sword intent of the Dragoncry sword. This proud sword intent, with reluctance, left the blade of the Dragoncry sword. In just an instant, the Dragoncry sword that only had half of it left, but was still proud, stubborn, and incomparably bright, became dim and lightless, as if it had died. The sword intent entered Chen Chongqing's body, then entered the dagger at his waist. Although his heart of the sword had already reached perfection, he was limited by his cultivation, so his sword intent had never reached great success. As a result, he could only borrow the Mountly sword intent from the yellow paper umbrella in order to control the 10,000 swords and kill the monster tide. It was precisely because of this reason that his sword intent and dagger had never truly merged together. In other words, this seemingly ordinary dagger believed that his sword intent was not worthy of it. Only now did the sword intent of the Dragoncry sword arrive. The dagger was still in the sheath, but it began to buzz. Chen Chongqing understood the meaning of the Dragoncry sword. This was the inheritance. He was somewhat sentimental. The Dragoncry sword passed its sword intent to the dagger, then died, but the dagger came to life. Right now, he could only hope that the Dragoncry sword could use this method to extend his life, or in other words, his pride. Then, he needed victory. He lightly placed the other half of the Dragoncry sword on the ground, stood up, grabbed the hilt of the dagger, and pulled it out. With his action, a sun appeared in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. This sun followed the body of the dagger and rose from the sheath, illuminating the gloomy mausoleum and grassland. It was countless rays of golden light. It was an incomparably bright sword. An incomparably powerful chi appeared with it, shocking all the living beings in the surroundings of the mausoleum. There was silence. The sword intent of the Dragoncry sword and the dagger perfectly fused together, just like the feeling when Chen Chongqing held the dagger before. It was as if they were born together, but this was still not enough. The soul of the sword still had not awoken. In my original thoughts, I should have directly finished writing this part, but yesterday I said that there were a lot of things to do at home, and I don't know why it's so cold today. I suspect that it's a cold, so I'll have to trouble everyone to wait for another day. Tomorrow I'll decide the victor, have a good time, and then leave. Chapter 340. Burn. Chen Chongqing said to himself very calmly. As these 3 words rang out in his heart, the plains that bore the radiance of the stars and snowflakes began to burn violently. The intensity of the fire was countless times greater than before. In just an instant, the snowflakes had been completely burned away. At the same time, the surface of the clear lake surrounding the Spirit Mountain also began to give birth to a deep blue flame. It was extremely beautiful. The snowflakes melted into clear water, turned into clouds, or condensed into water again, or spread out in the form of clouds. These were all true essence, violently wreaking havoc in his body, forcefully opening his blocked meridians. The dried-up riverbed, regardless of whether it was the stone forest or the bottomless abyss in front of him, he continued to resolutely advance. The violent true essence ignited his blood, burning away his internal organs and meridians, bringing him unimaginable pain. It caused his face to become extremely pale, but it also caused his eyes to grow brighter and brighter. Chen Chongqing raised his cultivation level to the peak without the slightest scruple, standing on the threshold between life and death. He was fighting with his own life. Only by doing so could he provide the dagger in his hand with enough true essence and awaken its soul. In the sky in front of the mausoleum, the huge golden-winged Great Ping indifferently looked down at him. Strong winds and white streams of air mixed into the light at the edges of its wings, making it seem abnormally magnificent. The divine flames in its eyes became even more awe-inspiring, and there was even a faint hint of admiration. Chen Chongqing's body that had been bathed in dragon blood possessed an almost perfect defensive ability. However, as the snowy plains burst into flames, even the lake water began to burn. An unimaginable amount of true essence exploded in his body. His body finally could not endure it any longer and began to crack. The first to crack was the corner of his eyes, followed by his eardrums. Several streams of blood flowed out from his 5 senses, and soon after, the skin on his face also began to crack. Streams of blood flowed out, and the scene was abnormally terrifying. Within the cracks of blood, one could see flesh and bones, as well as flames that were faintly discernible like stars. Blood flowed on his face, on his hands, wetting his clothes and the hilt of his sword. It landed on the ground of the stone platform, and then continued to burn. An indescribable fragrance spread out from his blood into the surroundings of the mausoleum. As the blood burned, the fragrance became countless times thicker, spreading even further, until it reached the edge of the plains. The ones most sensitive to this fragrance were naturally the demonic beasts. The black sea around the mausoleum began to surge again. The monsters that were suppressed by the might of the golden-winged great Ping and did not dare to raise their heads could not endure the allure that seemed to come from the deepest part of their lives, that came from the fragrance of blood. One by one, they raised their heads to look at the top of the mausoleum and gasped for breath. Their saliva dripped from their mouths, and their eyes were scarlet red, excited and greedy. The golden-winged rock also smelled the scent of blood. In the shadows that covered the sky, its eyes were like 2 flickering divine fires. At this moment, the 2 divine fires burned violently with a boom. The indifferent divine aura finally had some kind of emotion. That emotion was admiration, yearning, longing, and desire for life. This was the emotion that Chen Chongqing feared the most. It was the thing that he had once feared the most, but now he was not afraid, because life and death were separated by a thin line. His feet had already stepped on the doorstep. If he had to burn himself to awaken this soul, why did he need to care about those gazes? The shadow of the golden-winged great Pung fell on the mausoleum. It unfurled its wings, and covered the plains with a circumference of several thousand li. Regardless of whether it was the sky or the earth, they all became gloomy. All of the light in the mausoleum was blocked, and the darkness was like a true night that the plains had never seen before. The 10,000 swords trembled slightly, almost unable to endure it. Some swords gradually floated down like fallen leaves. An absolutely supreme pressure mixed with the most perverse and true greed and desire, as if it had become something tangible, fell on Chen Chongqing, who was in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. In an instant, the blood that flowed on his body congealed, and the burning flames extinguished. The black hair that was tightly bound behind him loosened, and then from the ends of his hair, it began to wither and turn yellow, gradually turning into ash and rustling down. "Wake up," he thought to himself as he looked at the dagger in his hand. "Wake up," he silently said to his heart. What was his heart? It was the ethereal palace. Where was his ethereal palace? On the Ling Tai mountain. Chen Chongqing's ethereal palace had long since opened the gate of Chen Chongqing's ethereal palace. There was not a single fallen leaf on the Ling Tai mountain. It was enveloped by the lake water that seemed both real and illusory, and the mountain was in the lake. The lake water that floated in the sky was very clear and extremely transparent. Its surface burned with blue flames, and in the deepest part of the lake, the spiritual soul of the black dragon floated quietly. Following Chen Chongqing's call, an extremely light tremble spread from the ethereal palace to the mountain path of the Ling Tai mountain, and then to the lake. The lake water began to ripple gently, gently washing over the black dragon's body. It was like a gentle caress, just like how her father would wake her up every morning before he left home. The black dragon slowly opened her eyes, and a sliver of confusion appeared in her vertical pupils. She looked at the ice in the lake water around her, and only after a while did she remember what had happened before she fell asleep. Afterwards, she felt the tremble from the ethereal palace in the depths of the lake water, and heard Chen Chongqing's voice. She only needed an instant to understand what was happening outside, and even saw the golden-winged great Ping in the sky. A cold aura emitted from her pupils. It was pride and disdain. Although she was only a spiritual soul at the moment, she was still unable to endure the golden-winged Great Peng's challenge to her. The pride and disdain turned into a violent rage. A clear and angry dragon's roar resounded from the depths of the lake water. It did not travel far, but it incessantly roiled the lake water, and the surface of the lake burned even more violently. With a loud boom, the black dragon broke through the lake water, left the ethereal palace, and flew over the plains where the snow had already been burned away. It followed the true essence river formed from mist and clear water, flew over the riverbed that was no longer dry, flew over the broken streams and the deep abyss, and followed Chen Chongqing's consciousness into his arm. Then, it left and entered a new world. The black dragon's spiritual soul entered the dagger. To her, this was a completely unfamiliar world, filled with golden rays of light. What made her feel the most inexplicable familiarity was that in this world she felt two extremely familiar qis. These two qis were so powerful that they made her feel somewhat uneasy, but she could not bring herself to oppose them, because these two qis belonged to her elders. No one knew, not even Chen Chongqing himself, how intimately connected this dagger was to the dragon race. In Xining Village's old temple, Yurin had gifted this dagger to him. He had used this dagger to participate in many battles, and the sharpness of this dagger had already shocked the world many times. However, in reality, this dagger's true power had never been displayed. This was because his cultivation level was too ordinary, and he was unable to cultivate a sword intent that was worthy of this dagger. It was also because after this dagger had been successfully forged 15 years ago, it had always been in a state of unwillingness, unwilling to wake up. Only now, when the dragon's soul entered the dagger and met with the sword intent of the Dragoncry sword, did the dagger finally wake up. It truly woke up. Chen Chongqing did not know what had happened to the dagger, but he knew that the dagger had already woken up. The dagger's soul had awakened. He raised his head to look at the golden-winged Great Peng above the mausoleum. His expression was calm, his eyes were bright, and filled with battle intent. The 10,000 swords around the mausoleum followed his gaze and slowly adjusted their direction, pointing towards the Great Peng. They were about to set off. "Go," he said to the dagger in his heart, but he did not know that these two words had come out of his mouth. "Go!" He threw the dagger in his hand towards the sky. The dagger turned into a streak of golden light, leaving the stone platform in front of the mausoleum's main entrance, and quickly flying towards the golden-winged Great Peng. The world trembled, and 10,000 streaks of golden light appeared in front of the mausoleum. The 10,000 swords cried out in unison, giving off either clear or hoarse sounds. The 10,000 swords whizzed through the air, following the dagger. Let out a great light. The yellow paper umbrella gently swayed in his left hand, as if it was cheering, as if it was a blessing. The dagger drew a straight line in the gloomy sky. The 10,000 swords followed closely behind it, forming a thin belt about 10 li long. The 10,000 swords arrived high in the sky. The rays of light that flowed out from the wings of the golden-winged Great Peng fell on their bodies. The 10,000 swords reflected the rays of light, and constantly flickered with light, as if they were scales. The 10,000 swords were like 10,000 scales, linked together in the sky. At the very front of them was the dagger. The dagger emitted an unimaginable pressure and light. Vaguely, in that holy light, there seemed to be a golden dragon head. It was the head of a huge golden dragon. The dragon's whiskers danced, and it cut through the sky. I do not know when the next chapter will be updated, but it will definitely be. I will update it as soon as possible. Chapter 341. A golden dragon appeared in the night sky. A dragon's roar tore through the night sky. A dragon's breath crushed the entire grassland. Countless monsters prostrated themselves on the ground, trembling and not daring to move. Even the strongest and proudest mountain fangs were the same. Any monster that attempted to raise its head to look was immediately turned into a pool of blood. As for those flood serpents that had luckily survived the battle, their bodies twitched in fear, as if they would tear themselves into pieces and commit suicide at any moment to show their piety. Because this was a dragon, a truly supreme existence that was even higher than the golden-winged great Pung. It was already close to a god. The divine flames in the golden-winged great Peng's eyes were still violent, yet strangely silent. It looked at the huge golden dragon that flew out of the mausoleum and exploded with a powerful battle intent. It was born from light, so how could it be afraid of the dazzling light? Its life was used to challenge the authority of the dragon and phoenix, so how could it be afraid of the pressure emitted by the golden dragon? Moreover, the 10,000 swords forming a dragon, could it be a real dragon? A ruthless roar resounded through the sky. The golden-winged great Pung whistled through the air towards the mausoleum. The entire sky above the grassland was shaken to the point that it somewhat deformed. As it stretched out its claws, several dozen li of the grassland seemed to be grabbed up by it. It wanted to use its claws that could tear apart the world to pierce through the head of the golden dragon. The golden dragon formed from the 10,000 swords broke through the air. Its eyes were indifferent, proud and cold. The dragon's whiskers danced, completely shattering the lightning high up in the sky. It carried a supreme pressure and light, but miraculously, its dragon's breath also carried an extremely deep chill. In an instant, the sky around the mausoleum began to snow. In that instant, the divine flames in the golden-winged great Peng's eyes suddenly flickered. It was because of the extreme chill from the dragon's breath, and also because it suddenly discovered a shocking fact. This dragon formed from 10,000 swords was actually a real dragon. Even more terrifying was that this sword dragon actually carried two kinds of dragon might. The golden dragon and the black frost dragon. The strongest, noblest, and most divine dragons of the dragon race, and at the same time, the two dragons that could not coexist with each other, were actually perfectly united in this sword dragon. At this moment, this dragon formed from 10,000 swords was actually even stronger than the golden dragon and the black frost dragon. The golden dragon and the golden-winged roc met high in the sky and met again in the blizzard. An angry and unwilling wail and a pained roar resounded in the sky. The golden-winged roc's right claw instantly shattered. The huge shadow cast in the sky was torn apart by the dragon formed by the 10,000 swords. The golden dragon's body had also suffered a terrifying wound from the roc's claws. Tens of thousands of rays of light swayed uneasily. The blood of the golden-winged great Pung flowed out crazily, turning into golden jade liquid that fell onto the grassland. It burned violently, burning thousands of demonic beasts to death. Then, it turned into a hurricane that wreaked havoc everywhere, lifting up countless amounts of earth. The blizzard and the flowing fire danced wildly between heaven and earth, intertwining. Gold roared and continued charging towards the golden-winged roc. Its mouth was wide open as if it wanted to swallow the entire world. A loud bang resounded. Golden light shone brightly in the sky, and the night sky suddenly disappeared. The plains in front of the mausoleum all sunk down by a layer, several dozen li in radius and a depth of over 30 meters. Countless demonic beasts died there. Grass and stones were crushed. Even the cliffs at the highest point of the mausoleum collapsed into several pieces. With a rumble like thunder, they rolled into the grassland. Everywhere was the sound of air being torn apart, everywhere was the sound of space struggling to hold on, everywhere was the sound of violent divine might clashing, everywhere was the miserable howls of demonic beasts, until finally there was a violent dragon's roar. That dragon's roar was so clear and distant, as if it came from ancient times, but also as if it was new. It was incomparably proud and tyrannical. The 10,000 swords turned into a dragon, swallowing the world and eating the golden-winged roc. After an unknown amount of time, the blizzard gradually thinned. Snowflakes slowly floated down, and the violent and chaotic sounds also gradually disappeared. The grassland finally recovered some peace. The tens of thousands of demonic beasts that had survived looked up with fear and unease. They only saw that the sky was clear. Although it was snowing, there were no snow clouds. The shadow that had covered the sky for a very long time had also disappeared. A very small black dot floated down from the sky, just like a falling leaf. Only after a very long time did the black dot land on the ground, giving off a light clap. Compared to the violent movements from the great battle earlier, it was extremely difficult to notice. The one who fell from the sky was Nank. She landed heavily on the ground and spat out a lot of blood. The place where she landed was right in front of the mausoleum, right at the beginning of the divine path. Chen Chongqing looked at her. It was not intentional, but he naturally looked down on her. He knew that after defeating the golden-winged roc, the 10,000 swords were already broken and exhausted, but there were some things that needed to be finished. He raised his arm, pointed at Nank below the divine path, and silently said in his heart, "Go." The sky above the mausoleum suddenly lit up again. Under the lead of the dagger, the 10,000 swords turned around and pierced towards Nank. It was still a dragon, but its color was slightly fainter than before. The demon general couple stood in front of Nank. They looked at each other, and saw the determination and apology in each other's eyes. In reality, when the sword pool had appeared and the 10,000 swords were in the air around Chen Chongqing, they had looked at each other. At that time, there was only apology and determination in their eyes. At that moment, they vaguely knew that the military advisor's plan for the Garden of Zhou had completely failed. No matter how good the military advisor was, no matter how powerful Princess Nank was, no matter what hidden tricks she had, they were all unable to deal with the endless fortuitous encounters of this human youth. It was not the fault of battle, but fate. They felt that Chen Chongqing's fate was too good. The determination in their eyes when they looked at each other was because at this moment they had to break through. Only by recovering their true strength could they find a chance. However, in the Garden of Zhou, once they recovered their cultivation, it meant death. The 10,000 swords were like a dragon, descending from the sky to the ground. They stood in front of Nank and their chi suddenly increased. In an instant they became incomparably terrifying like real mountains. This was the strength of the peak of star condensation, even though they were not called this in Xuelao City. Black armor covered their bodies. From this moment onwards, they were no longer a normal middle-aged couple. They were no longer Ting Xiaoming and Lu Wan'er, but the 23rd and 24th demon generals. The 10,000 swords had arrived, and were slashing towards Nank. The demon general couple stood in front of Nank. The dragon's head spewed out a dragon's breath, bringing with it endless light. In this light, nothing could be seen or seen. Only sound could be heard. Countless concentrated hissing sounds could be heard. Those were the sounds of swords and armor, metal rods and pots rubbing against each other. The so-called dragon's breath was the sharpness of the sword. After an unknown amount of time, the golden dragon let out a long roar with an incomprehensible meaning. It completed its attack, then turned around and returned to the mausoleum. Ting Xiaoming and Lu Wan'er stood in front of Nank, quietly looking at each other. The black armor on their bodies was already broken, and their bodies that were as tough as stone were covered in sword slashes. Ting Xiaoming looked at her and calmly said, "I'm sorry, I can't accompany you back to your hometown to farm and watch the sunset." Lu Wan'er said, "The one who should be sorry is me. If I didn't have to return to my hometown, we would still be at the front lines, and not be killed by a dragon for no reason." Ting Xiaoming did not say anything. Lu Wan'er said, "The sunset in my hometown is much more beautiful than the sun here, but if you look at it too long, you'll get tired of it." Ting Xiaoming said, "Yes, the scene of the 10,000 swords transforming into a dragon was very beautiful." As they spoke, several bolts of lightning descended from the sky. In order to help Nank block the violent attack of the 10,000 swords forming a dragon, the demon general couple simultaneously raised their cultivation to the peak of star condensation. The laws of the Garden of Zhou reacted, and naturally began to attack. They did not dodge because they were already dead. In order to block the 10,000 swords forming a dragon, they had used the great art of disintegration, so they were destined to die. The heavenly lightning continued to descend, which seemed rather stupid. The 10,000 swords returned to the mausoleum. In the light, Chen Chongqing extended his hand and grasped the dagger. However, the 10,000 swords did not disperse. Instead, they continued to surge towards him, as if they wanted to kill him. Countless sword howls rang out, and they arrived in an unending stream. He subconsciously closed his eyes. After a while, the sword howls disappeared. There was silence. When he opened his eyes, the 10,000 swords had already disappeared. Only the dagger was still grasped in his hand. Thank you, everyone, for suppressing your impulse and anger to read the following plot 2 days ago, and not scolding me. Old readers all know that when I write the climax, I'm used to writing it all in one breath. I'm even more anxious than the readers, and I want to get that scene out. It's just that now is not the same as before. Especially with the end of the year approaching, I have to make many preparations. I'm a middle-aged man, so I can't do anything about it. Like the scene where the 10,000 swords return to one, it was definitely written by someone before, but when I wrote it, I still felt that it was very cool. I just requested that it must return to silence at the end. As for the part about the demon general couple, it was actually a bit out of the ordinary, but after thinking about it for a long time, I couldn't bear to delete it. This was because when I first wrote it, I was prepared to use the two of them to admire life. Even if they like to eat human flesh, this is still their life. I'll say a few more words and I'll sigh with regret. It's getting harder and harder to make characters in novels. Of course, in the end, it's still a problem of one's own ability. Tomorrow is Monday, so I'll have to trouble everyone to vote for me. In addition, I'll also have to trouble everyone to vote for my free work from the Golden Keyboard. Thank you. Chapter 342. The wretched howls of the monsters gradually stopped and the plains of the unsetting sun regained its peace. Only the occasional clap of thunder could be heard high up in the sky. The energy contained in the thunder did not know where it should land, so it could only dissipate in the air, shaking the clouds and causing them to constantly scatter. Chen Chongqing gripped the dagger and walked up the divine path. As his feet landed, a splash of water appeared. Countless fine sword marks appeared on the limestone ground, a sign that his sword had accidentally spilled. He looked down the divine path. Nank had already woken up. The two maids had fainted behind her, but they were still alive. Nank was covered in blood as she sat in the rain. Her face was abnormally pale, especially the space between her slightly wide brows. It was so white that it seemed transparent. Her soul had merged with the great Ping and had been heavily injured by the 10,000 swords. She could no longer stand up. She looked at Chen Chongqing with a slightly perplexed expression. She could not understand just what was going on. Why did the sword pool want to help this human youth? And what was up with that dragon? Why did it have the dragon might of the golden dragon and the black frost dragon? If it was Su Yorong, perhaps she could still accept the result of defeat, because she was a phoenix. She had a certain advantage over the golden-winged Great Ping, but how could Chen Chongqing? The dragon, shouldn't it be Qiushanjun? Her perplexity only lasted for a moment. She quickly sobered up and raised her hand with some difficulty. She used the back of her hand to wipe the blood from the corner of her lips and said expressionlessly to him, "You think you can leave the garden of Zhou just like this? This kind of thinking is disrespectful to the mighty soul in the mausoleum." Chen Chongqing thought to himself, the plains have already been destroyed to this extent and the sword pool no longer exists, so what need is there for respect? He did not reply to this question because he was not good at conversing. Up until now, he had not used words to reply to this question twice, but had directly used his sword to reply. "You will still die in these plains." Nank said, "We will all die here." Chen Chongqing did not understand why she said such a thing. Did she want to fight for some time before death arrived and hope for a miracle? Nank saw his expression and knew that he did not understand why she said such a thing. She asked with slight mockery, "Have you never thought about why the garden of Zhou has the sword pool?" He stood on the divine path and gazed at the boundless plains. Of course, he had thought about it before. In the eyes of many people, the sword pool was Zhou Dufu's funerary object, a wordless stone tablet that he had erected for himself. However, after entering these plains and experiencing such a soul-stirring battle, how could they still think of this matter so simply? Zhou Dufu had engaged in countless battles in his life. Everyone said that he was obsessed with martial arts, but he was not an idiot. If it was for the sake of pursuing the heavenly Tao, opponents like the Demon Lord, Chen Xuanba, and the Mountly Sword Sect Master could be ignored, but it was very obvious that many of the opponents in these battles were not qualified to be his opponents. Moreover, why did he leave his opponent's sword in this grassland after every victory? And these swords were unable to leave this grassland. What was it that was restraining them? You don't know anything, but you still did it, and you actually succeeded. I really don't know if you're lucky or stupid. Nank looked at him and said. Her expression was somewhat complicated, and it was difficult to tell if it was pity or ridicule. Before the demon general couple decided to die, they also had similar thoughts. They felt that Chen Chongqing's life was too good. However, Chen Chongqing was keenly aware that his life was not good, so if what Nank said was true, then did he do all these things because he was stupid? He did not know what to say. After entering the garden of Zhou, Nank had never smiled. Even in Xuelao City, she rarely smiled. However, at this moment, she happily smiled. Her smile was innocent and pure, but her eyes were very evil, just like a child who had succeeded in pulling a prank. You've done so many things, worked so hard for so long, even burned your life to fight for a path to survival, but in the end, you'll still die. Everything has become meaningless. Don't you feel despair right now? Chen Chongqing vaguely sensed that she was speaking the truth. Something might happen next. Although he did not understand what was going on, he thought it over and said, "Even if we all die in this grassland in a little while, it's still better than us dying and you living. Since it's like this, then our efforts obviously have meaning." His voice was rather tired and very calm, but it still made people speechless. However, there was a voice in his heart that constantly sounded out, as if it was urging him to leave. After experiencing this bitter attack on the mausoleum, countless monsters had died. However, to the monster tide that was like an ocean, it was still only a small portion. From this, it could be imagined what terrifying numbers and battle strength the monsters possessed, but these monsters were not used to suppress the sword pool, but to guard the mausoleum. Everything existed for a reason, and a place like the Garden of Zhou was even more so. Since the monsters were Zhou Dufu's method to prevent humans and demons from approaching his mausoleum, then why did he leave the 10,000 broken swords in the Garden of Zhou? Why did he leave the 10,000 broken swords in the Garden of Zhou, and bury them in the pool of water in the grassland? And what did he rely on to restrict the 10,000 swords in the surroundings of the mausoleum? Chen Chongqing did not have an answer, and neither did Nank. Before entering the Garden of Zhou, her teacher Blackrobe had once warned her that there was a mysterious power in the grassland that restricted the sword pool, and at the same time, the sword pool was also a restriction against that mysterious power. Only by reaching a certain balance between the two could the existence of the grassland be guaranteed, so after entering the Garden of Zhou, she could not attempt to find the sword pool. Even if she did find the sword pool, she could not do anything about it. As a result, after entering the grassland, in order to find Zhou Dufu's mausoleum, she did not hesitate to let Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong escape for such a long time, but she did not show any interest in the sword pool. However, the sword pool was still discovered. It turned out to be a sea of swords in the grassland, and then the 10,000 swords in the sword pool were summoned by Chen Chongqing. From that moment on, she knew that the balance of the planes of the unsetting sun had been broken. Something big would happen in the Garden of Zhou, and it might even be destroyed. In order to prevent all of this from happening, she made a great effort, but unfortunately, she still failed in the end. However, just what was that mysterious power? Chen Chongqing looked into the depths of the grassland, but did not discover anything. He then turned around, and did not continue down the divine path. Nank and the two maids were already crippled, so they could not stop him from leaving. The scene of the demon general couple dying while staring at each other in the 10,000 sword glows made him feel rather tired, and he needed to make the best use of his time. Walking to the corner next to the main entrance of the mausoleum, he extended his hand to support Su Yorong, preparing to leave with her. However, when his hand was still several inches away from her shoulder, it suddenly froze in the chilly wind. After a while, he slowly straightened his body, turned around, and once again looked down the mausoleum. A resentful sob resounded through the grassland, just like the leaf flute played by the elves in the past. It was the heavily injured earth monkey that was crying. Amidst the filthy water, grass, and corpses of monsters, it hugged the thick leg of the mountain-toppling fiend and wept sorrowfully. Just what was this treacherous, cunning, and even terrifying high-level monster crying for? The battle between the 10,000 swords and the golden-winged Great Ping had affected the surface of the grassland, and the mountain-toppling fiend's body had gained even more terrifying wounds. However, it was still a powerful monster ranked third on the ranking of earthly beasts, so it could clearly still endure and would not die. Just what was the earth monkey crying for? Was it crying for its own broken leg? Chen Chongqing did not understand, but he felt a chill in his body. This was because the earth monkey's sobs were very sorrowful. Those who heard them would be grieved, on the verge of tears, and would be extremely terrified. As its sobs spread, more and more monsters began to howl in pain. These low-level monsters did not know how to cry. Their howls of pain and their moist eyes were crying. Nank closed her eyes. She was waiting for death. She was not waiting for Chen Chongqing to kill her, but for the destruction of the Garden of Zhou. Chen Chongqing silently gazed at the grassland. At this moment, the sky had already recovered its clarity. Dawn was approaching, and the blue color had reappeared. The thunder had already gradually faded, and everything was peaceful. Only the sorrowful cries of the monsters constantly reminded him that destruction was imminent, and that everything was too late. There was nothing strange about the grassland, but in his eyes it seemed to have lightened slightly. Indistinctly, some sort of change that he could not understand was occurring. It was a sort of feeling, or perhaps it was because all the swords in the grassland had already been taken away by him. The grassland was lightening, the sky was turning blue, and the light was turning clear. A clear light appeared from a certain place in front of the mausoleum. It traversed a distance of countless li from the ground, and landed in the blue sky. It was completely silent, as if nothing had happened. It was like a drop of ink falling into a bowl of clear water. The drop of ink into the clear water seemed gentle, but in reality, in the next moment, that clear water would completely turn black. The blue sky suddenly lightened, or perhaps it could be said that it had become clear. With the passage of time, the color of the sky grew fainter and fainter. In reality, faintness was transparent and it was bright. In the place where the clear light had disappeared, a piece of the bright and transparent sky suddenly floated down. That was a piece of real sky. The fragment of the sky slowly floated down to the ground. Chen Chongqing stared at the fragment of the sky, and his face became paler and paler. All the monsters raised their heads and gazed at the fragment of the sky. They stopped their sorrowful cries, and became deathly silent. The speed at which the fragment of the sky floated down was very slow, just like real fallen leaves. It seemed like it could be dodged, but the sea of monsters on the surface of the grassland did not have any intention of dodging. This was the Garden of Zhou, their entire world. Now, the entire world was about to be destroyed, so where could they possibly hide? The grassland around the mausoleum was quiet. Only the earth monkey continued to weep sorrowfully. No matter how the mountain-toppling fiend gently stroked its head, it was unable to make it stop its sorrowful cries. It and its companions had lived in this vast grassland for countless years. Now, this grassland was finally about to be destroyed. It and its companions had guarded this mausoleum for several hundred years, but they were still unable to defend it. How could they not be angry? How could they not be afraid? How could they not despair? How could they not be in pain? The earth monkey's sorrowful cries echoed through the deathly silent grassland, rising and falling along with the floating fragment of space. It was like a song of endless sorrow. Yesterday was the wedding day of the 9 classmates of my book friend. I would like to express my warm congratulations. I hope that all of Guangdong will run out of washboards. I will try to finish the next chapter before 10. Also, this chapter has nothing to do with Chairman Zhou's marriage. I am very happy for it. Chapter 343. The so-called sky was the boundary of space. It was weightless, so its fragments were naturally even lighter than the lightest leaf. They drifted down towards the grassland, sometimes in the east, and sometimes in the west, several hundred li away. It was simply impossible to capture their trajectory. After an unknown amount of time, under the gazes of countless terrified and despairing gazes, the fragment of the sky finally landed on the surface of the grassland. Whether it was intentional or not, it just happened to land on the mountainous body of the monster bull at the back of the monster tide. In an instant it became an extremely dazzling white flame, spitting out endless light and heat. The monster bull let out a sorrowful and indignant cry, and just like that, disappeared in the white flame. Let alone its remains, not even ashes or smoke were left. The grassland violently shook, and all the monsters in a range of several li fell to the ground. The monsters that were stuck to the ground like serpents were so shaken that they vomited blood and died. The shaking spread to the mausoleum, and countless clouds of dust sprayed out from between the huge rocks and the cracks between the limestone. The 2 maids, Ning Chui and Hua Qiu, were roused by the shaking. They felt the terrifying explosion of energy in the distance, and their faces paled in fright. They did not know what had happened. Nank closed her eyes and sensed the crack in the blue dome of the sky. She vaguely understood something and muttered, "So that's how it is." What had already happened could not be changed. What they needed to do was to find the source of why it had happened. Chen Chongqing quickly withdrew his gaze, and looked at the place where the clear light had shot into the sky. He discovered that the clear light had come from a stone pillar in front of the mausoleum. In the surroundings of the mausoleum, there were 10 stone pillars of similar shape. Yesterday, when he and Su Yorong had come to the mausoleum of Zhou, they had already noticed these stone pillars. These stone pillars were several zhang tall, and their surfaces were carved with some unknown patterns. With the erosion of time and wind and rain, these patterns had already become indistinct, making it even more impossible to understand their meaning. The reason why he had noticed these 10 unremarkable stone pillars was because they made him think of the stone pillars outside the Li Palace. It was also because these stone pillars seemed too shabby compared to the majestic mausoleum, giving off a very incongruous feeling. They seemed somewhat out of place with the mausoleum, as if they were not a single entity. Looking at it now, these 10 unremarkable stone pillars really were strange. These stone pillars actually contained such terrifying energy. The clear light they emitted could tear a piece of the sky apart. The shard of the sky effortlessly turned the powerful monster bull into nothingness, simultaneously disappearing without a trace. The plains once again regained its peace, or perhaps it could be called a deathly silence. Whether it was Chen Chongqing, the 2 maids or the countless monsters, they all stared at the stone pillar, an indescribable nervousness and unease. Suddenly, a piece of stone fell off the surface of the stone pillar. The piece of stone was about a few fingers thick and a few feet wide. When it landed on the blue stone ground, it shattered and made a light sound. The voice was very soft, but in the deathly stillness of the grassland, it was so soul-stirring. The beast tide set off waves, and countless demonic beasts were so frightened that they collapsed among the water plants. A moment later, another strand of chi passed through the surface of the stone pillar. It turned into a streak of clear light and silently floated away from the mausoleum. At this moment, Chen Chongqing sensed that it was an incomparably ancient and supreme presence. That aura was even more ancient than this continent. Just what were these stone pillars? This time, the clear light did not fly towards the blue sky. Instead, it seemed to very casually drift towards the edge of the grassland. It was unknown where it would fly to before stopping. Countless terrified gazes stared at the clear light, as if they were sending it off with their eyes. They watched as the clear light flew 1,000 li away, to a place that could no longer be seen clearly. After a very long time, a muffled sound of impact and a clear tremor reverberated from the edge of the grassland to the surroundings of the mausoleum. Because it was too far away, the muffled sound was not very loud, but the tremor was still violent. Countless water plants danced in the air, and the mausoleum was once again filled with dust. The powerful tremor almost caused Chen Chongqing to fall, but his gaze did not move at all. He continued to stare at the stone pillar, and noticed that another piece of stone had fallen off. The stone pillar had been weathered by wind and rain for a long time. Its surface was extremely rough, and its color was a dull gray. It looked just like ordinary stone. After the two pieces of stone had fallen off, the interior of the stone pillar was revealed. Under the illumination of the clear sunlight, it could be seen very clearly. It was black. The chi within the stone pillar continued to pass through the surface and spread outwards. It turned into streaks of clear light and danced above the grassland. Sometimes it landed high up in the sky, sometimes it landed at the edge of the distant grassland, or sometimes it landed on the ground not far from the mausoleum. It tore apart the sky, overturned the earth, and brought about a terrifying explosion. The clear light contained an extremely terrifying energy that could not be blocked. Even if Chen Chongqing had 10,000 swords, he still could not do it. This was because the chi emitted by the stone pillar had already far surpassed the scope of his understanding. It was an energy that had not even been recorded in the Taoist canon. The world trembled, and the violent explosion of energy enveloped the entire plains of the unsetting sun. Although it could not be seen, it could be imagined that the entire garden of Zhou was currently in such a situation. With the appearance of the clear light, the layer of stone on the surface of the stone pillar constantly fell off. It shattered into pieces below the stone pillar, revealing more and more of its true appearance. The inside of the stone pillar was still stone, but its color was black. It seemed mottled, just like a rubbing that had not been properly made. Looking at the mottled surface of the stone pillar, looking at the exposed black stone, Chen Chongqing felt that it was somewhat familiar for some reason. Thinking of a certain possibility, his fingers that gripped the hilt of his sword turned slightly white. His body trembled slightly, and his lips were abnormally dry. Previously, when he faced the golden-winged Greatping, he had even dared to wield his sword and fight. However, at this moment, looking at the stone pillar, he actually seemed to have lost even the courage to draw his sword. He thought in his heart in shock. It can't be. The stone pillar continued to emit clear light, and the layer of stone continued to fall off. More and more of the black inside was revealed. The violent explosions of energy finally met, and turned into countless terrifying hurricanes. They began to wreak havoc on the grassland. The tremors from all around the Garden of Zhou were all transmitted to the mausoleum, to his feet. What was even more terrifying was that the other 9 stone pillars in the surroundings of the mausoleum also began to tremble slightly. Gravel rustled off the surface of the stone pillars, and the terrifying chi was about to appear. Chen Chongqing gripped the hilt of his sword. He knew what he should do, but he did not know how to do it. His mind was somewhat absent-minded. The hilt of the sword trembled slightly. As it turned out, The 10,000 broken swords buried in the grassland were used to suppress these stone pillars. More accurately, they were used to temporarily seal the chi within the stone pillars. Now, the sea of swords had been taken away by him, so the thing that was hidden within the 10 stone pillars was about to appear. Just what were these stone pillars? Chen Chongqing had already guessed it, but he did not dare to believe it. He was unwilling to believe it. However, this matter had already truly happened. The layer of stone on the surface of the stone pillar had already been mostly peeled off. A square black stone gradually appeared between the heaven and the earth. It towered between the heaven and the earth. Although there was still some layer of stone remaining on the surface of the black stone, one could already see those complicated lines that were difficult to understand. Of course, Chen Chongqing should have felt that it was familiar. Anyone who had stared at it for so many days would not find it familiar. In the mausoleum to the south of the capital, he had once seen many things similar to this black stone. There were countless lines on the surface of the black stone. The lines were patterns, and the square stone engraved with the text was naturally a monolith. As it turned out, the black stone was a monolith. It was a black monolith. The heavenly tome monolith. Today, because of some reason, I'm especially angry. In order to divert my mind, I've created a lottery on Sina Weibo. Just like last time, it's purely for fun. After updating it, I'll post the lottery on Weibo. Everyone can go and participate. Using real money, I hope it can please my mood. Originally, I've been writing quite happily recently, but after encountering this kind of thing, really, everyone knows my Weibo name, right? If you don't, then I'll say it again. Something's too fishy. Yes, such a shameless ID, it's definitely mine. Everyone, see you tomorrow. Chapter 344. Countless years ago, the heavenly tomes transformed into a stream of fire and descended into the world, landing in the southern part of the current capital. Naturally, a mound rose up, and that was the mausoleum of books. Countless stone tablets were scattered among them, and they were one with the earth. They could not be separated at all, nor could they be moved. No matter in the Taoist canon or the history books, there were no records of these stone tablets leaving the mausoleum of books. So when Chen Chongqing spent a day in the mausoleum of books to see the 17 heavenly tome monoliths of the front mausoleum, he saw a broken monolith at the very end of the monolith hut. He thought in shock just who could actually break a heavenly tome monolith and take it away. Now, looking at the stone pillar below the mausoleum that emitted a clear light and the stone layer that was constantly peeling off, he knew that the heavenly tome monoliths that left the mausoleum of books were in the stone pillar. In other words, the person who broke a heavenly tome monolith and took it away was Zhou Dufu. That's right, other than Zhou Dufu, who else in the world could do such a world-shocking thing? He looked at the other 9 stone pillars around the mausoleum, and his body became more and more stiff. If these stone pillars were also heavenly tome monoliths, then did Zhou Dufu not take away 10 heavenly tome monoliths from the mausoleum of books? So this was the greatest secret of the Garden of Zhou. No matter if it was the inheritance left behind by the experts of the previous generation, or even the sword pool or Zhou Dufu's having blade technique, none of them could compare to the secret in the stone pillars. Just as he was thinking about these things in shock, the other 9 stone pillars also began to emit a chi that seemed to come from ancient times, and the clear light gradually rose. The clear light fell into the sky and tore the sky into pieces. Those pieces landed on the grassland and exploded with an unimaginable storm of energy. The world changed color, and the hurricane that wreaked havoc on the grassland became more and more terrifying. It even swept up the monsters that were as heavy as mountains and the rocks under the wet mud. The shaking of the earth became more and more violent. No monsters could stand still anymore, and they all fell to the ground. Those monsters that struggled to fly into the sky could not even fly out of the grassland before they were swept far away by the countless turbulent air currents. It was unknown whether they were dead or alive. The grassland, as well as the world of the Garden of Zhou further outside, all became extremely chaotic. They were on the verge of destruction. Even the majestic mausoleum began to tremble. There were huge rocks that were torn apart by the storm of energy, turning into heavy rocks that rolled down from high above. They produced rumbling sounds like thunder, crushing many monsters that could not dodge in time along the way. The whirlwind arrived at the mausoleum. Nank closed her eyes and waited for death in the fierce wind. She was instantly swept up and floated towards the back of the plane. The two maids, Ning Chui and Hua Qiu, let out sorrowful cries and desperately ignited their spiritual bodies. They turned into two streaks of spiritual light and arrived at her side. They instantly turned into wings of light and attached themselves to her body. The whistling gale carried Nank's body into the distance. The wings of light quickly became specks of light, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Seeing this scene, Chen Chongqing calmed down. He used the Yesher step to break through the tearing of the fierce gale and returned to the front of the mausoleum's main entrance. His left hand gripped the dagger and stabbed it into the thick and heavy stone door, while his right hand extended towards Su Yorong. He was prepared to untie Su Yorong's belt and tie her to himself. Su Yorong woke up and looked at the desolate plain in front of her. Her expression was slightly perplexed, but when she saw that the 10 stone pillars in front of the mausoleum were currently emitting clear light, she very quickly deduced everything. Her face became abnormally pale and she muttered, "He really did place it in the garden of Zhou." A clear light landed not far from the main entrance of the mausoleum. The divine path collapsed and there was a violent tremor. Chen Chongqing was jolted back into the stone wall. His right hand tightly gripped the hilt of his dagger, which was why he was not swept away by the gale and was unable to grab her. The tong bough in Su Yorong's hand swayed in the wind and turned back into the luxuriant wudong tree. The roots of the tree stuck tightly to the stone wall, helping her stabilize her body. In the whistling gale, the green leaves fell one by one. Her black hair floated past her pale face and slightly absent-minded eyes. Chen Chongqing looked at her and yelled, "How can you make this stop?" Ever since he entered the plane, he was used to listening to her suggestions. He knew what kind of wisdom and insight she possessed, and he had also faintly heard what she had said before. Although he did not understand why she understood this matter so well, only needing a glance to know what had happened. Su Yorong studied the heavenly tomes day and night at Holy Maiden Peak, and she also had a deep relationship with the Divine Empress, so she knew this secret that basically no one else knew. Looking at the 10 stone pillars, she was extremely shocked. After a while, she returned to her senses and muttered to herself, "There are still 2 missing." Back then, Zhou Dufu had cut down 12 heavenly tome monoliths in the mausoleum of Book. Now, there were only 10 around the mausoleum, so where were the other 2 heavenly tome monoliths? Even though it was such a tense moment, she, who was accompanied by the heavenly tomes day and night, still subconsciously thought of this question first, and only then did she hear Chen Chongqing's voice. Her finger quickly drew on the ground, calculating the relative positions of the 10 stone pillars around the mausoleum and deducing the connection between the stone pillars. She was already extremely weak, and had always been in a deep sleep. As soon as she woke up, she had to carry out such complicated calculations. Her mind was extremely exhausted, and in just an instant, her face became as pale as snow. The fierce wind swept up the gravel and landed in the mausoleum, giving off an extremely terrifying sound. The hard cliff rocks were instantly hit with countless holes. Even the wudong tree that was transformed from the tong bough was on the verge of collapse. Green leaves constantly fell, and it seemed like it was about to be pierced through. Seeing this scene, Chen Chongqing did not think any further. He took a risk and pulled out the dagger from the cliff rock. Taking advantage of the gap in the wind, he moved to Su Yorong's side with difficulty and opened the yellow paper umbrella, helping her block the arrow-like gravel. The yellow paper umbrella constantly gave off heavy banging sound. It was quiet under the yellow paper umbrella. Chen Chongqing did not say anything, as he did not want to disturb her calculations. After an unknown amount of time, Su Yorong shook her head and said, "I can't calculate it." Chen Chongqing's gaze passed over the edge of the yellow paper umbrella and landed on the stone pillar in front of the mausoleum. He said, "There should be a way." This was not blind optimism, but a stubborn belief. Since Zhou Dufu was able to suppress these heavenly tome monoliths back then, they would definitely be able to as well. Their current cultivation levels were obviously far from Zhou Dufu's back then, but that method should be there, waiting for them to discover it. The positions of these 10 stone pillars and their relationship with each other are rather subtle. It should be a kind of formation that allows the qi between these stone pillars to clash with each other, forming a kind of balance. Logically speaking, it should not be as violent as it is now. I can't calculate what the problem is. Su Yorong was currently very weak. When she said those words, she actually revealed an extremely rare feeling of defeat. Chen Chongqing said, "In the past, the sword pool should have been responsible for suppressing the balance. Now that the sword pool has been taken away by me, if I release the 10,000 swords now, will it be of any use?" Without needing too many specific details, Su Yorong already knew what had happened when she was unconscious from his few short sentences. Without any time to be astonished, she once again began to calculate. However, even after adding the variable of the sword pool, she discovered that this matter still did not make sense. If she wanted the stone pillars to calm down again, if she wanted the great formation to work again, if she wanted the world to return to balance, she needed even more heavenly tome monoliths. But where could she go to find the heavenly tome monoliths? Who knew where the remaining 2 of the 12 heavenly tome monoliths that Zhou Dufu had taken from the mausoleum of books? And even if she found those 2 heavenly tome monoliths, the world of the Garden of Zhou was currently collapsing. Who could stop the fall of the sky? Thus, it was useless. Whether it was the reappearance of the sword pool or the calming of the stone pillars, it was already useless. The Garden of Zhou was on the verge of destruction. The humans, demons, and monsters left within would all turn to ash or be swept into the void. Su Yorong lowered her head and looked at her slightly trembling fingers. She tightly pursed the corner of her lips, just like a stubborn little girl currently grieving. She felt very useless. Chen Chongqing understood and said no more. At this moment, he held a sword in one hand and an umbrella in the other. He had no way of patting her shoulder to comfort her, much less to hug her and give her warmth. As a result, he could only move closer to her, sitting a little closer. His shoulder lightly leaned against hers, hoping to give her some support. The hurricane swept up countless pebbles and struck the surface of the yellow paper umbrella, bringing with it an extremely terrifying vibration and sound. It was like a giant beating a war drum. If not for the incomparably powerful defensive capabilities of the yellow paper umbrella, they would already be dead. It was very quiet inside the umbrella. Su Yorong leaned against his shoulder, seeming very powerless. The next chapter, before 9 o'clock. Chapter 345. The monster tide was like a sea, its shadow obscuring the sky. Zheshio, with Qi Jian on his back, ran in the opposite direction. Qi Jian used his weak mind to point out the way, correcting his occasional deviations. It was just that there were problems with space and time in these planes. No matter how fast Zheshio ran, he could not escape. As a result, once he was some distance away from that shadow, he stopped and rested for a while. At the same time, he pondered what he should do next. Just then, 10,000 sword glows appeared in the sky above the plains. The sea of swords had appeared behind them. Qi Jian watched this scene from his shoulder. He was shocked, speechless, and his body became incomparably stiff. "What happened?" Zheshio asked. Qi Jian said in a trembling voice, It seems like the sword pool has appeared." Zheshio fell silent, then said, "Continue." The battle between the monster tide and the 10,000 swords did not affect them in the distance. Through Qi Jian's somewhat monotonous description, that magnificent scene had become much more tedious. Zheshio still listened very seriously, because he knew that these strange movements might be the last chance for the two of them to leave the plains alive. And when the 10,000 swords rose into the sky, transformed into a golden dragon, and swallowed up the golden-winged great Peng, he accurately grasped an important point in Qi Jian's description. That sword at the very front is a dagger? Qi Jian had not recovered from her heavy injuries, and after fleeing for so many days, she was already incredibly weak. If not for the fact that she had to show Zhixuo the way, she might have fainted at any time. However, she had cultivated the path of the sword since she was a child, and her eyes were like intelligent swords, able to clearly see distant objects. She very definitely gave a yes. Hearing her words, Zhixuo unhesitatingly put her on his back and continued to walk away from the battlefield. Qi Jian asked, "You recognize the origin of that dagger?" Zhixuo replied, "That's Qin Chongqing's dagger." Confused, Qi Jian asked in shock, "It's Qin Chongqing? Then, shouldn't we go help?" Previously, she had clearly seen that although that dagger had led the 10,000 swords to successfully defeat the golden-winged Great Peng, it was clearly on the verge of collapse. If it really was Qin Chongqing battling the demons in the depths of the plains, how could Zhixuo, as his companion, ignore it? Upon hearing her question, Zhixuo's footsteps did not slow, but instead sped up. He said, "If he can resolve that problem, then he doesn't need our help. If he can't resolve it and can only buy a little more time, then if we turn around and go back, we will be wasting the chance to live that he has given us." Qi Jian had grown up in the Mountly Sword sect, so he was used to the love and help of fellow disciples, never leaving or abandoning each other. He was somewhat unable to understand Zhixuo's way of thinking, and just when he was about to argue, he heard Zhixuo continue emotionlessly, "If I were the one fighting the demons, and Qin Chongqing was carrying Su Yurong here, I believe that he would also not turn around." Hearing this, Qi Jian still found it hard to accept, but in the end, he fell silent. Because Zhixuo had said that Qin Chongqing would also make the same choice, and had even compared their relationship to the relationship between Qin Chongqing and Su Yurong, she did not know how to respond. With her on his back, Zhixuo continued to run towards the periphery of the plains. At this moment, a beam of clear light fell into the sky. In the next moment, the fragments of the sky fell on the grassland. An explosion occurred and a gust of wind blew. A strong vibration directly knocked them down into the water grass. With great difficulty, Zhixuo stood up from the pool of water and asked, "What's going on?" Qi Jian looked at the distant sky, her face pale. "It seems like the sky is collapsing." Zhixuo was silent for a while, then he lifted her up from the water grass and continued to run towards the periphery of the plains. It really was the sky collapsing. Countless violent storms of energy engulfed the entire plains, and then easily tore apart the seal at the edge of the plains, heading towards other parts of the Garden of Zhou. Terrifying tearing sounds could be heard everywhere, and the world seemed to be on the brink of destruction. Zhixuo and Qi Jian were very lucky. On the way, they were not struck by the storms of energy brought about by the clear light. Even more fortunate was that the appearance of the heavenly tome monoliths had brought about the collapse of the heavens and the rend of the earth, directly destroying all the seals on the plains. The flow of time in different areas had disappeared, and with it, the boundaries between spaces had also disappeared. Just like this, they madly ran out of the plains of the unsetting sun and arrived at the base of Sunset Valley. It was still night in the Garden of Zhou. Sunset Valley reflected the light of that distant ball of light, but it was not as tranquil and beautiful as it usually was. The storms of energy brought about by the appearance of the heavenly tome had already engulfed this place, and the cliffs of Sunset Valley had already fallen off. It was as if a terrifying earthquake had just occurred, and earthquakes were still occurring. Qi Jian endured the pain in her lower abdomen and the effects of the medicine. She forced herself to maintain her mind, and guided Zhixuo through the rubble of the mountain. Zhixuo once again transformed, his sharp claws and teeth piercing deeply into the ground. He leapt and ran along the precipitous cliffs, narrowly avoiding several landslides. Finally, he arrived at a garden at the edge of the Garden of Zhou. When Qi Jian saw a woman dressed in the ceremonial robes of the 13 divisions of radiant green, the breath that she had been holding tightly the entire time instantly dissipated. Unable to endure it any longer, she fainted. This was the mountainside Whispering Wood, a place where human cultivators gathered. To Zhixiu, Chen Chongxing, and the others who had entered the plains of the unsetting sun, several dozen days and nights had already passed. To the human cultivators here, not too much time had passed. Of course, to them, it was already long enough. Because of the demon's scheme, the Garden of Zhou was in chaos. People wanted to leave, but they could not. To them, time was extremely difficult to bear. At this moment, the terrifying tremors from the depths of the plains and the even more terrifying storms of energy directly made them feel the danger of death. The garden was in chaos. Everywhere there were anxious questions, and there were also many cries of despair. They did not know when the gate to the Garden of Zhou would open, nor did they know if the Garden of Zhou was truly about to be destroyed. The Garden of Zhou was a miniature world with a very complicated structure. On the other side of the cliff, there was still a very large region. That large lake had long since recovered its tranquility. The blood of Nank's 2 maids had already been washed away by the lake water. The blood that had flowed from that treacherous sword that had pierced through Qi Jian's lower abdomen had also been covered by the gravel on the shore of the lake. Liang Xiaoxiao and Zhuang Huanyu stood on the shore of the lake. They did not look at each other, nor did they talk. They were both expressionless, but they represented completely different emotions. Liang Xiaoxiao gazed at the inauspicious blood-red color in the distant sky and felt the tremors from the depths of the lake. He glanced at Zhuang Huanyu and said, "Let's get out of here alive first, then we can talk about anything else." Outside Honshu City, the fog was still thick. Although it was night, that rainbow that came from tens of thousands of li away was still dazzling. In the end, that sliver of chaos had long since disappeared. However, it was impossible to reverse the events that had already occurred and make them disappear. In the thick fog, that invisible gate to the Garden of Zhou was still tightly shut, and it was unknown when it would open. Zhu Luo stood at the very front of the dark forest, looking at that rainbow in the fog. His expression was grave and stern, and it was unknown what he was thinking. As one of the strongest human experts, one of the storms of the 8 directions, it was unknown how many storms he had seen in his life. No matter if it was a cold wind or a bitter rain or a reign of terror, such as when the demons had infiltrated the Garden of Zhou and severed the connection between the inner and outer parts of the Garden of Zhou, although it was somewhat shocking to him, it was actually not that big of a deal. Under his supervision, the many priests of the Orthodoxy and the experts of Tianliang County were currently using some sort of formation to repair the gate to the Garden of Zhou where the rainbow had landed. Looking at the degree of distortion in the space in the fog, it should only take a little more time before it would succeed. However, just a moment ago, he sensed something extremely bad. Something seemed to have happened in the Garden of Zhou, and it was about to collapse. For an expert of his level, he had an incomparably deep understanding of the laws of space. He clearly understood that any miniature world would have a moment of collapse or annihilation. Even the central continent would disappear after tens of thousands of years, but a miniature world that could be discovered and used would definitely be a relatively stable and sturdy space. The Pope's green leaf world was like this, and Zhou Dufu's Garden of Zhou was also like this. No matter how he looked at it, the Garden of Zhou should still be able to exist stably for at least several tens of thousands of years, so why did it suddenly show signs of collapse? No one could rely on their own strength to destroy a world, even if it was a miniature world. He could not, the Pope could not, and Zhou Dufu also could not in the past. The power that could destroy a world could only be the world itself. If the Garden of Zhou was about to collapse, the cause would definitely be the Garden of Zhou itself, or some sort of power that surpassed space. Zhu Luo thought of that rumor, and his expression became more and more grave, like frost. At some point, Mei-Lisha had arrived at his side. The archbishop's aged face had always carried a habitual weariness, but at this moment, only worry could be seen. His eyes were still squinted, but as long as one stood a little closer, they would definitely be able to clearly feel the coldness in those two eyes. His voice was slightly hoarse as he asked, "How much longer before the door to the garden of Zhou can be opened again?" Zhu Luo spread out his spiritual sense, using the method of profound insight to sense the degree of spatial distortion in the thick fog. He gave a relatively accurate judgment: it should be able to open before dawn. Mei-Lisha's eyes narrowed even more and he said, "No, it's too slow." Even when facing peerless experts on the level of the storms of the 8 directions, his words were still so direct, even full of pressure. Zhu Luo gazed at the southern night sky where the rainbow was rising and said, "We've already done everything we can do. If we want it to be a little faster, we'll have to see Mount Li." Mei-Lisha understood his meaning, and gazed at that precipitous mountain to the south that was actually invisible, in silence. No one noticed that his hand was lightly trembling within the sleeve of his archbishop's robe, and naturally no one could hear the voice of this virtuous and respected old man in his heart. "Chun Chong Xing, you cannot die." This rainbow that had risen from tens of thousands of li away was not the key to the Garden of Zhou. If one wanted to describe it more accurately, the rainbow was the key's action to open the Garden of Zhou. Black Robe had used that square plate to affect the rainbow, causing the door to the Garden of Zhou to temporarily close. In reality, in the instant that the key was inserted into the lock of the Garden of Zhou, he had placed a few more things into the keyhole. The key to the Garden of Zhou had always been in Mount Li, in the dwelling at the highest peak of Mount Li, and also the place where the rainbow had risen. With a creaking sound, the door to the dwelling was pushed open. An old man with the bearing of an immortal walked out, his hand stroking the hilt of his sword. His eyes were as calm as a lake, but within the lake were 1,000 swords. It was the current sect master of the Mount Li sword sect. See you tomorrow. Chapter 346. Before the opening of the Garden of Zhou, before the rainbow had appeared, Mount Li had already entered a state of complete vigilance. Xiao Songgong and the 3 Discipline Hall elders sat on different parts of the mountain path. Mount Li's myriad sword array was hidden in the depths of the sea of clouds, ready to kill any invading enemies at any time. However, it was not completely foolproof. Only when the Mount Li sect master used his true sword did the rainbow stabilize. At the same time, the strange qi within the rainbow was completely expelled. Regretfully, it was too late to stop the demons from closing the gate to the Garden of Zhou. If they wanted to reopen the gate to the Garden of Zhou and let out the several hundred human cultivators that had entered, other than the formations laid down by the experts of Honshu City, the most important thing was still the rainbow that rose from Mount Li. After all, the key was here. In the past period of time, Mount Li had been silent. Everyone had been paying attention to the activity at the summit. Now that the sect master had finally walked out of the cave, the people who had been waiting bitterly rushed forward and bowed. Xiao Songgong solemnly asked, "Senior, how is the situation?" The Mount Li sect master gazed at the night sky to the east, at the still bright star. "At dawn, the Garden of Zhou can be reopened." Hearing this, Xiao Songgong breathed a sigh of relief. However, he discovered that the sect master's expression was still grim. In particular, the calm lake of sword intent in his eyes was faintly moving. He could not help but feel extremely uneasy. He asked, "Could it be that there are other changes?" The Mount Li sect master withdrew his gaze from the east and followed the rainbow to the north, where Honshu City was located. He said, "Something major is currently taking place in the Garden of Zhou, and there are already signs of collapse. I don't know if the people inside will be able to last until morning." The Mount Li sword sect disciples present were shocked, but they did not dare to make a racket. After a while, an elder of the discipline hall worriedly asked, "Is there any other way?" The Mountly sect master did not speak, but everyone naturally understood what he meant. A disciple asked, "How is eldest brother doing?" With his question, many of the Mountly disciples turned their gazes to the tightly shut door of the dwelling. To the disciples of the younger generation of Mountly, it seemed that nothing could stump their eldest brother. Although they clearly knew that their senior brother's cultivation could not compare to their martial uncle's, they still subconsciously placed their hopes on him. The Mountly sect master looked at the disciples and said, "In order to reopen the gate to the Garden of Zhou as quickly as possible, your eldest brother has practically burned all of the true dragon's blood in his body, and he still wants it to be even faster? Could it that you want him to cripple his cultivation? Or do you want him to die under this rainbow?" The disciples were shocked again, and did not dare to say anything more. Right at this moment, a voice sounded out from the cave, "Master, disciple still wants to try again." This voice was so tired and weak, but it was still as clear and pleasant as usual. The emotions in the voice were still so calm, confident and determined. More importantly, this voice was still the same as before. No matter what situation it encountered, it would not be depressed, and it had a free and easy feeling. Hearing this voice, for some reason, the disciples felt somewhat at ease, just like they usually did. The Mountly sect master looked at the dwelling and sternly said, "If you try again, only death awaits you." The voice disappeared for a while, then resounded once more. It was still calm and incomparably firm. "Junior sister is still in the Garden of Zhou." This was the reason, this was the truth, this was the reason that everyone in the world knew and was willing to believe in. The Mountly sect master could hear that in the seemingly calm voice of his most beloved eldest disciple, for the first time, there was genuine anxiety. How could he have the heart to stop him? In the depths of the plains of the unsetting sun that was filled with energy storms, the mausoleum was surrounded by violent hurricanes. The pools of water on the plains had long been completely evaporated, and the wet mud had also become dry gravel. As the wind wildly danced between the heaven and earth, sand and dust floated in from the edge of the yellow paper umbrella, dimming the light. Su Yorong leaned on Qin Chongqing's shoulder and softly said, "Will we die?" She, who had just been pulled back from the brink of death not long ago, was currently extremely weak, both physically and mentally. Qin Chongqing's gaze passed over the edge of the yellow paper umbrella and stared at the 10 stone pillars in the surroundings of the mausoleum. He thought of the results of her calculations from before, and was currently making some sort of comparison. Suddenly, he heard her words, thought about it, and said, "Perhaps, but I won't let you die." Su Yorong softly said, "Before, if you had not given me your blood, I would already be dead. But actually, at that time I was not afraid of death, but now I am afraid. I don't know why." Qin Chongqing looked into her eyes and said, "Perhaps it's because you have a reason to live?" Su Yorong thought about it and said, "Perhaps." Qin Chongqing smiled from the bottom of his heart and said, "I'm very happy." Su Yorong looked at him and smiled, "I'm also very happy, but the more it's like this, the more I don't want to die." Qin Chongqing seriously said, "Yes, so I'm thinking about how to continue living." Su Yorong teased, "Are you very good at thinking of ways?" "No, but something like how to continue living. I've thought about it quite a lot." After saying that, he continued to observe the sandstorm around the mausoleum, as well as the scene in the sandstorm, especially the area that was previously covered by white grass, but was now covered by gravel and the corpses of monsters. Many monsters had already died, and even more monsters were fighting against the sandstorm. Or perhaps it could be said that they were swept up by the sandstorm and flew everywhere. Death would come sooner or later. Other than the yellow paper umbrella in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum, there was no other place that could give shelter to these once powerful and ruthless life forms. Just at this moment, a black shadow passed through the violent turbulence of energy and the whistling sandstorm, and arrived in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum like lightning. Through the extremely small crack at the edge of the yellow paper umbrella, it entered the umbrella, and heavily fell on the thick and heavy stone door of the mausoleum. The stone door gave off a muffled sound from the collision, and several cracks appeared on it. To be able to avoid the energy storm released by the heavenly tome monoliths, to be able to ignore the sandstorm that filled the sky, and to almost knock over the main entrance of the mausoleum, was a bird. This bird was covered in messy feathers, and did not look beautiful at all. Its right claw was already crippled, and its body was covered in bloodstains. It looked just like a pheasant that had just escaped from a hunter's arrow. This pheasant slid down from the center of the crack in the stone door, and landed on the ground. It used one leg to stand up with difficulty, twisted its neck, and flapped its wings. It seemed to be somewhat satisfied, and then looked at the sandstorm that filled the sky at the edge of the yellow paper umbrella, and let out a few angry cries. The space under the yellow paper umbrella was very small. The sand that the pheasant had flapped out all landed on Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong's faces, and the two of them could not help but cough. Hearing the coughs, the pheasant seemed to have thought of something. Its pair of bewitching, golden eyes rolled around twice, and then it instantly became abnormally quiet. It did not even glance at Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong, and quietly retreated backwards, as if it wanted to avoid their line of sight. The problem was, the area under the umbrella was only so big, so where could it hide to? It's not Nank, not the vermilion bird. It's definitely different from Fatty Yi. Next chapter, before 7 o'clock. Today's update will have fewer words. Chapter 347. A delicate hand reached over and gently stroked the head of the pheasant. The pheasant was somewhat dissatisfied, but it did not dare to express any dissatisfaction. It obediently straightened its neck, allowing the hand to stroke it. It looked like a quail. It was Su Yorong's hand. The pheasant knew very well what kind of blood flowed within this girl's body. It disliked it very much, but it had to admit that it was its nemesis. Chen Chongqing's hand also reached over, as if he also wanted to stroke it. The pheasant also knew very well how powerful this youngster was. Most importantly, he was the master of the yellow paper umbrella. If it wanted to survive in these terrifying energy storms, it could not offend him. Let alone a few strokes, even if he wanted it to dance a hair removal dance, it would still have to endure. But for some reason, the pheasant extended its sharp beak like lightning and fiercely pecked down on the back of Chen Chongqing's hand. A clear sound, like the striking of gold and jade, rang out. The pheasant was stunned. It did not understand why it would do such a crazy thing. Chen Chongqing was also stunned. Then he remembered that although the wounds on his body had basically healed, and the smell of the blood that flowed out had already become extremely faint, for this kind of creature, it was still an irresistible temptation. Although it is said that a great pung in distress is not as good as a pheasant, it is still a great pung and has its own pride, Su Yorong said while looking at him. This was not the original saying. The original saying was that a phoenix in distress was not as good as a pheasant, but she would definitely not say it like that. Just as she said, this mixed bird that looked like a pheasant was the golden-winged great pung that had previously covered the entire sky, but now it had long since lost its former might. The moment he entered the yellow paper umbrella, Chen Chongqing knew that it was the golden-winged great pung. Because of its qi, because of the berserk divine fire in the depths of its eyes, no matter how well it disguised itself, being able to pass through the storm of energy and the hurricane, and knowing that only the yellow paper umbrella could protect it, it was definitely the great pung. The original body of the golden-winged great pung had long since died or left with Zhou Dufu. Only a few days ago, when Nank returned to the garden of Zhou with the soul wood, did its soul, which had always slumbered in the shadows of the grassland, awaken and be reborn. The current golden-winged great pung was still a fledgling, and did not have the strength and cultivation it had when it was at its peak. It was no wonder that it could only transform into a shadow in the sky. Only when Nank fused her soul and the energy of the soul wood with the great Pung did it recover the majority of its divine might. Chen Chongqing didn't try to touch the young rock again. The young Ping gradually calmed down, and was no longer as nervous and vigilant as before. The berserk intent in the two wisps of divine flames in its eyes receded, and was replaced by a very complicated emotion. Chen Chongqing understood what it wanted to express, and could not help but stare blankly. The information that the young Pung wanted to convey was all in its eyes. It was beseeching, requesting, begging, sorrow, sadness, gloom, and despair. The countless monsters in the Garden of Zhou were all its companions and subordinates. These monsters had lived in the grassland for several hundred years, isolated from the rest of the world, and not contending with people. This grassland was their home, and now their home was about to be destroyed. Chen Chongqing said in his heart, "I don't need you to ask me anything. I will do my best to preserve this world." The young Pung seemed to have heard his thoughts, and became even quieter, appearing extremely obedient. However, what was interesting was that it still did not want to approach him. On the contrary, it would rather move a few steps towards Su Yorong, who it should have feared and loathed, and obediently leaned into her embrace. Chen Chongqing had always been paying attention to the sandstorm around the mausoleum from the corner of his eye. As he conversed with Su Yorong and mentally communicated with the great Pung, he had always been silently making calculations in his heart. According to what Su Yorong had said before, the connection between the 10 heavenly tome monoliths in the surroundings of the mausoleum was a change in some formation. Now that the sword pool had appeared, the balance of the formation had been broken, and there was no way to restore it, unless he could find the sword pool to replace the vanished emptiness. Yes, in this formation, the sword pool was only a replacement. What did the sword pool replace? Su Yorong had said that Zhou Dufu had taken 12 heavenly tome monoliths from the mausoleum of Book. There were only 10 stone pillars here, so where were the other 2 heavenly tome monoliths? At the very beginning, Chen Chongqing always felt that he had forgotten something. It was the emptiness in his memories when he was viewing the monoliths and comprehending the Tao in the mausoleum of Books. Afterwards, he vaguely remembered something, and a conjecture uncontrollably appeared in his heart. In order to prove his conjecture, he had always been observing the surroundings of the mausoleum, looking for evidence that could prove his conjecture. He had to obtain sufficient confirmation before he would act on his conjecture, because that would be an extremely risky move. A person only had one life, so he only had one last chance. The sandstorm filled the sky, and the ground around the mausoleum would occasionally accumulate sand dunes like small mountains. Sometimes, even the hard limestone ground would be lifted up. The place he had always been observing was also the place that Su Yorong had calculated. The place that was once covered by white grass, and was now covered by sand and monster corpses, finally revealed its true appearance from several hundred years ago. There was a broken stone wall there. It looked like a base of a monolith. There should be a heavenly tome monolith here. Chen Chongqing had confirmed this fact. With a slight movement of his spiritual sense, he took out an item and held it in his hand. Afterwards, he looked at the young Pung. The young Pung instinctively felt uneasy. It wanted to look in another direction, and did not want to meet his gaze. However, it discovered that because it was too nervous, its neck had actually stiffened. The man and the Pung looked at each other, and the atmosphere was somewhat strange. The young Pung thought in its heart, "Why me?" Chen Chongqing said in his heart, "Because you are the outstanding golden-winged great Pung. Only you can withstand the devastation of the energy storm, at least for a period of time." The young Pung thought resentfully, "Why don't you go?" Chen Chongqing tightened his grip on the handle of the umbrella, and said in his heart, "Even if I gamble correctly, the Garden of Zhou will still be destroyed. I have even more important things to do." The young Peng's consciousness fell silent, and accepted his words. Chen Chongqing opened his palm, and in the center of his palm was a black stone. This black stone was about half a finger long, and its shape was slender. It was completely black, and the surface of the stone seemed to be covered with a faint layer of mist. It was like a night sky without stars, but with starlight. It caused people to become intoxicated by it, wanting to sink into it. It was clearly not an ordinary object. This was the black stone that he had found behind Wang Jitsu's portrait in the Pavilion of Ascending Mist. Seeing this black stone, a hint of fear flashed through the young Peng's eyes. After a while, it calmed down a little, and opened its beak to pick up the black stone. Chen Chongsheng turned the yellow paper umbrella to the side, leaving a path for the young Peng to leave. When he was doing these things, he had always used his body to block Su Yorong's line of sight. It was not because he did not want her to discover his secret, but it was not because she wanted to stop him from doing what he was about to do. The wind rose, and the young Peng turned into a black shadow. It flew out of the yellow paper umbrella, and passed through the fierce winds and those terrifying cracks in space in the mausoleum. Following the guidance of Chen Chongsheng's line of sight, it flew through the sky full of sand to the very inconspicuous base of the monolith. It released its beak, and after a while, the black stone accurately landed on the base of the monolith. It was as if the starry sky had arrived in the garden of Zhou that never had a starry sky. It was very dark, but also very peaceful. A powerful and peaceful qi emerged from the base of the monolith. In the next moment, a black heavenly tome monolith appeared on the base of the monolith. Chapter 348. As the black stone landed on the base of the monolith, it turned into a black heavenly tome monolith. A distant and ancient qi emitted from the monolith, and it gradually merged with the qi emitted by the other 10 monoliths. The formation that was hidden in the relative positions seemed to undergo some kind of subtle but absolutely important change with the arrival of this qi. The surroundings of the mausoleum became slightly quieter. The rock on the surface of the stone pillars no longer continued to peel off. The surface of the black monoliths that had already been exposed was suffused with a faint cold light. At least several hundred spatial cracks that were as thin as threads floated between the stone pillars. The spatial cracks that floated between the stone pillars that were like threads were actually very terrifying. They were as gloomy as an abyss, and anything that came into contact with those cracks would be sliced apart. Once it was swallowed up by those cracks, it would be sent into a different space, enduring an eternity of lonely drifting. Fortunately, it was currently bound by some kind of power, and did not continue to drift. The clear cry of the young Peng resounded in the whistling gale. This cry was so happy, and it was filled with the delight of succeeding in its revenge. In its previous life, it was Zhou Dufu's mount. It had once personally seen its powerful master suppress those arrogant monoliths. Now, it seemed as if it had just happened again, so how could it not be proud? Chen Chongsheng withdrew his gaze from the spatial cracks, and looked towards the 11 stone pillars surrounding the mausoleum. He made another verification according to the deduction method that Su Yorong had mentioned before, and confirmed that the formation had controlled the explosion of energy brought about by the appearance of the heavenly tome monolith. At the same time, he confirmed that his memories and that seemingly miraculous idea were not wrong. Back then, when he was observing the heavenly tome monoliths at night in the mausoleum of books, the 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum formed a star chart. However, it was always incomplete, so he was unable to break through that threshold. Only at the very end, when the black stone he had obtained from the Pavilion of Ascending Mist shone brightly and completed the star chart, did he truly comprehend the true meaning of the heavenly tome monoliths, and thus broke through to the upper level of ethereal opening. Countless starlight washed the mausoleum. At that time, he was in a state of mind wandering, and did not know what had happened in his own spiritual world. Afterwards, he even forgot about the use of the black stone, and only had an extremely vague and blurry impression. Fortunately, he still remembered it in the end, and was able to verify it. The black stone behind Wang Jitsu's portrait in the Lingyan Pavilion was a heavenly tome monolith. At this point, the greatest secret of the Mausoleum of Books, as well as the greatest secret of the Garden of Zhou, could even be said to be the greatest secret of the continent in the past 1,000 years. Finally, the majority of its true appearance was revealed before his eyes. Although the stories that had happened between those peerless experts had already been destroyed and forgotten, he had already seen some truth. Many years ago, Zhou Dufu had taken away 12 heavenly tome monoliths from the mausoleum of Book. This matter in itself was extremely shocking, and no one could understand how he had done it. However, at the same time, the fact that he was able to preserve these heavenly tome monoliths outside the mausoleum of books was also an extremely unimaginable matter. The heavenly tome monoliths were sacred objects of the heavenly Tao. Contained within the monoliths was a berserk energy that did not belong to this world. That chi and energy came from another world. To this world, they were like countless sparks, while the mountains, rivers, seas, trees, and beastmen of this world were all just a pile of dry firewood. Once dry firewood and intense fire met, countless flames would inevitably be born. Fortunately, countless years ago, when the heavenly tomes descended into the world, it naturally formed some sort of restriction. The heavenly tome monoliths and the earth became one, borrowing the power of the thick earth to rest. As a result, in the mausoleum of books, this energy could very calmly be stored within the monolith. Once they left the mausoleum of books, those chi that were incompatible with this world would naturally leave the monoliths and ignite everything in this world. Those distant and ancient chi seemed calm, but to this world, it represented destruction. Therefore, the heavenly tome monoliths could not leave the mausoleum of book. Yet Zhou Dufu just had to do this, and he had even succeeded. One of the heavenly tome monoliths had been lost outside for some reason, so he brought the other 11 monoliths into the Garden of Zhou. Even though the Garden of Zhou was cut off from the world, even though his abilities were close to miracles, he still had no way of hiding the chi of these 11 monoliths, preventing them from coming into contact with the real world. As a result, he used his shocking methods and genius wisdom to think of an extremely wondrous method. He had these 11 monoliths form a formation. This formation was a kind of ingenious imitation of the restrictions of the mausoleum of books, or it could even be said to be a miniature version of the mausoleum of books. Su Yorong was able to see the connection between these stone pillars in such a short amount of time, and see through Zhou Dufu's wondrous methods, precisely because she had always been studying the mausoleum of books and the heavenly tome monoliths since she was young. Relying on this formation, Zhou Dufu made the chi of the 11 monoliths that had left the mausoleum of books suppress each other. They came in an endless stream, forming an independent world of their own. Relying on this seemingly fragile balance, he prevented destruction from happening. In order to prevent people from destroying this balance, he left behind countless terrifying monsters in the plains of the unsetting sun. If things continued to develop like this, perhaps after Zhou Dufu died, with the passage of time, the laws of the Garden of Zhou would gradually collapse, and the mausoleum would collapse. However, the 11 monoliths that were hidden in the stone pillars would still remain undiscovered, silently enduring the wind and rain for eternity. However, there was no such thing as eternity in this world. In reality, not many years after Zhou Dufu entered the mausoleum of books to seize the monoliths, a man had secretly entered the Garden of Zhou and had designs on these stone pillars. Purely in terms of cultivation and battle prowess, that man was obviously inferior to Zhou Dufu, but in terms of other aspects, in the hearts of the people, he was even more outstanding than Zhou Dufu. That man was Wang Jitze. Perhaps it was because he was ordered by Emperor Taizong to search for the whereabouts of the heavenly tome monoliths, or perhaps it was just to confirm some of his conjectures. Wang Jitze entered the Garden of Zhou, and then, using some unknown method, he took out a heavenly tome monolith from one of the stone pillars. At the same time, he miraculously turned that heavenly tome monolith into a piece of black stone. Zhou Dufu naturally discovered this, and then a problem appeared. One of the 11 heavenly tome monoliths was gone. This meant that the formation that he had spent so much effort on had been destroyed. The Garden of Zhou in the past was probably the same as it was now, filled with storms of energy and whistling hurricanes of destruction. Of course, Zhou Dufu could use his peerless strength to forcefully suppress the eruption of these heavenly tome monoliths, but just like at the very beginning, he could not stay between these heavenly tome monoliths forever, so he had to repair the formation. In other words, he had to find another heavenly tome monolith. It was very obvious that the imperial family of the Great Zhou and the Orthodoxy, who had already experienced it once, would not give him another chance. Perhaps when he was sitting between the mausoleum and pondering, he saw a sword in the sea of grass that was still unwilling to yield. It could be Qin Xuanba's Dragoncry sword, or it could be the Holy Maiden sword from South Stream Temple. This made him think of a method. Since it was very difficult to find another heavenly tome monolith, then he would find a substitute. Of course, the substitute had to be strong enough, and had to have the same power as the heavenly tome monolith. The substitute that Zhou Dufu chose was sword intent. He used the 10,000 sword intents to replace that heavenly tome monolith. Thus, the Garden of Zhou gradually regained its peace. The plains of the unsetting sun became peaceful once more. No one found that mausoleum again, and no one was able to discover the secret within those stone pillars. Until some year later, the soul of a sword separated, and the body of the sword flowed out of the plains along a pool of water. It passed through a small lake, and went to the world on the other side of the Garden of Zhou. It then floated up along the cold pool, and was washed into the forest by the river, where it was picked up by Su Li. As a result, an umbrella appeared in Wenshui, and that umbrella was now in Chen Chongqing's hands. Chen Chongqing took the yellow paper umbrella and returned to the Garden of Zhou. To the 10,000 sword intents in the plains, this was a return. Without the suppression of the 10,000 sword intents, the formation was destroyed, and the heavenly tome monolith appeared, beginning to destroy the world. However, no one could have imagined that he would also bring back the heavenly tome monolith that had been left outside. To the Garden of Zhou, this was a true return. This could very well be the story from back then. Of course, this was only Chen Chongqing's guess. At the moment, he did not know the true secret of the yellow paper umbrella. In this story that he had imagined, there were still many details that were not clear enough. For example, why did Wang Jitze only take away one heavenly tome monolith? Taking away one heavenly tome monolith was the limit of his abilities, or was it to say that the original intention of taking away the heavenly tome monolith was not to find it, but to destroy the formation and thus destroy the Garden of Zhou, or even to use this method to deal with Zhou Dufu? No one knew what Wang Jitze was thinking back then, and no one knew if a world-shaking battle had taken place in the Garden of Zhou. According to the records of history, Wang Jitze and Zhou Dufu had never fought. According to the legends of the people, they were sworn brothers, but who knew? Those experts that had once moved unhindered across the continent, the virtuous predecessors of the Star Brilliance capital, the way they interacted with each other and even the way they fought was not something that the current Chen Chongqing could understand. It was not even something that he could imagine. The young Ping passed through those terrifying cracks in space and flew back to the front of the mausoleum. Chen Chongqing looked into its eyes, but did not say anything. It understood, and its eyes became gloomy. It thought to itself, "This is a transaction. Since I have already completed it, why should I continue helping you? Also, you can tell from her appearance that she's dead. What if I can't fly out in time?" Yes, it was still somewhat too late. The stone pillars no longer peeled off, and the heavenly tome monoliths no longer emitted clear light. The distant and ancient Qi once again retreated into the depths of the black stone. However, the world of the Garden of Zhou was already riddled with holes. Countless storms of energy were still tearing at the sea of grass and the mountain range. The most terrifying thing was that the sky was still constantly collapsing. The monsters on the grassland seemed to have felt a sliver of life, and were madly running away from the mausoleum with all their might. However, the mountain range in the distance was also collapsing. Who knew if they could escape before the world was destroyed? Chen Chongqing turned his head to look at Su Yorong. Su Yorong had already felt the changes outside, and her eyes were filled with shock as she looked at him. She understood the formation that Zhou Dufu used the 11 heavenly tome monoliths to form, and she was also the one who told Chen Chongqing how to solve the problem. However, she did not think that Chen Chongqing would actually be able to solve the problem. This made her very shocked, and even somewhat at a loss. Why did he have a heavenly tome monolith? However, she did not have time to say these things, so she did not say anything. The heavenly tome monoliths quieted down. They had to leave quickly and leave together. However, Chen Chongqing did not think this way. He looked at the garden of Zhou that was about to be destroyed and said, "You go first. Today is the worst day since the beginning of the book, choosing the heavens. I've been sitting there since noon. I want to curse, but I don't have any today. Actually, I understand the reason. It's because the next part of the plot is my favorite, so I don't dare to continue. That kind of fear often appears. Tomorrow I'll just finish writing this part of the plot. That scene will be very beautiful. See you tomorrow." Chapter 349. Why? Su Yorong's face was rather pale. The gate to the Garden of Zhou is about to open. Chen Chongqing glanced at the young Ping, but he was talking about something else. The reopening of the Garden of Zhou was obviously a good thing, but there was no joy in his voice, because the collapse was still continuing. He had followed Su Yorong's method and turned the black stone into heavenly tome monoliths, preventing the arrival of destruction, but it was not enough. The snow mountain had already begun to collapse. The initial tremendous power of the world had calmed down again, but who could stop the snow that was gradually falling and getting heavier? A storm of energy arrived in front of the mausoleum, accompanied by a dozen or so terrifying tearing sounds. The mausoleum began to violently shake, and a few huge rocks in the southwest corner collapsed. The azure sky had become gloomy because of the rupture, and there were still many fragments of the sky dancing in the fierce wind. It was unknown when they would fall onto the surface of the grassland. In the distant Garden of Zhou, there were countless flowing flames. Black smoke and flames were everywhere, and monsters were fleeing in panic. One could faintly hear many miserable howls and sorrowful sounds. This world was being destroyed. Su Yorong stared into his eyes. She did not have the strength to raise her hand and grab his collar, but that was what she meant. She had indeed said before that even if the heavenly tome monoliths were restored to balance, it would be useless. The Garden of Zhou had already entered the process of destruction, but if the gate to the Garden of Zhou was really about to open, then why did they not leave together? Why did she have to leave first? The sky is about to collapse. He looked into her eyes and said very seriously. And then, she looked into his eyes and asked very seriously, "If no one holds it, then no one will be able to leave in time." Chen Chongqing raised the yellow paper umbrella and stood up. He turned around and said to her, "I have to stay and think of a way to hold on a little longer." Su Yorong's slightly trembling voice was like the lake water startled by the rain. "You? What to do? How will you get it? What will you do?" He did not know which meaning she was leaning towards with her words. Chen Chongqing looked at her and said very honestly, "I'll see what I can do." The heavenly tome monoliths returned to the Garden of Zhou and the formation stabilized once more, buying the most precious period of time for the people in the Garden of Zhou. The gate to the Garden of Zhou was currently opening, but with the current speed, it was extremely likely that they would not make it in time. If the people outside could not open the Garden of Zhou in time and the sky fell, then the monsters that lived here and the several hundred human cultivators that entered the Garden of Zhou would all die to the sky full of fire. The Garden of Zhou would be destroyed, and so many lives might die. The most direct reason was because he had to take care of all the swords. He did not care about how they saved each other, and they had to go to the depths of the plains. He did not care about the sword intent or the sword. He did not care about the sword and the zhou. To the zhou, to zhou li and he. He once more, two of the sword li. He and he and two and he two and two. He, the pung, and he, the churn of garden, the pung two and chen. He, zhou, he, and chen. The only thing he could do now was to slow down the rate at which the garden of Zhou was being destroyed, so that the people in the garden of Zhou would have time to leave. It was also to comply with the young Peng's request, to fight for a chance for the countless monsters living in the plains to survive. As a result, he had to stay and hope that he could hold on a little longer, to fight for a little more time. But why was that? Su Yorong did not even have the time to ask this question. Her shoulders were grabbed by the young Peng, and she was lifted into the sky outside the mausoleum. The rock said that it could only carry one person. Chen Chongqing didn't have time to give a final explanation. He watched as the young Peng carried her and flew into the distance. Fierce scales danced around the mausoleum. Su Yorong was extremely weak, and could not do anything at all. She could only stare blankly at him standing on the mausoleum. She looked at him very seriously, as if she wanted to imprint his face in her mind. Seeing the figure on the mausoleum grow smaller and smaller, she yelled, "Su Xing, you idiot!" The wind was truly very strong. By the time her voice reached the mausoleum, it was already very soft. However, Chen Chongqing heard it and shouted a few words to her. It was just that the wind was truly very strong, so she did not hear it. "My name is not Su Xing, my name is Chen Chongqing." After saying that, he turned around and ran towards the top of the mausoleum. The mausoleum was very large. From the main gate at the end of the divine path to the highest point, there was a distance of several thousand zhang. Moreover, the rock that formed the mausoleum was very large, so it was extremely difficult to climb. Fortunately, he possessed strength and speed that normal people could not hope to reach. In a short amount of time, he arrived at the highest point of the mausoleum. He stood on the rock at the top of the mausoleum and looked at the fire that constantly fell from the distance. He looked at the black smoke and the burning garden, and he looked at the sky that seemed to shatter in front of him and the firmament that was about to collapse. He tightly grasped the sword in his hand. It really was going to collapse. Luoluo had once said something to him filled with emotion. That sentence was said to her by the White Emperor: "If the sky collapses, there will be someone tall to hold it up for you." Right now, he was at the highest point of the mausoleum, which was also the highest point of the Garden of Zhou. It was even higher than the peak of Sunset Valley. It was closest to the sky, furthest from the ground, and could see the furthest. As a result, he was currently the tallest person in the Garden of Zhou. If the sky collapsed, it should obviously be him who would hold it up. This had nothing to do with the phrase, "with great power comes great responsibility," because he believed that this was originally his responsibility. Moreover, he just happened to have the ability in this aspect. Who would have thought that he just happened to be on the mausoleum with an umbrella in his hand and 10,000 swords in his sheath? He switched the dagger and the yellow paper umbrella. With a swish, the sharp dagger pierced deeply into the rock, helping him stabilize his body in the fierce wind. Afterwards, he extended the yellow paper umbrella in his right hand towards the sky that was on the verge of collapse. With a crash, the yellow paper umbrella was opened in the fierce wind, and became a small, cowering yellow flower, as if it could be crushed into powder by the hurricane at any time. This yellow paper umbrella could be said to be the magical artifact with the strongest defensive ability in the world. Together with the proud and powerful sword intent that shrouded the sky, if it fell into the hands of a true peerless expert, it would definitely blossom with an extremely dazzling splendor. However, it was still impossible to rely on just this umbrella to hold up the sky, even if it was only the sky of the miniature world of the Garden of Zhou, not to mention the fact that the yellow paper umbrella was currently in his hands. As someone at the upper level of ethereal opening, He was obviously very impressive in the younger generation, but in front of this sky, he was so insignificant. "Please come out and help me," Chen Chongqing said in his heart. This was his responsibility, so he had to hold it up. This also seemed to be the responsibility of those swords, but those swords had originally been forced to stay in the Garden of Zhou, so he used the word please. Without any pause, following his will, the air around the huge boulder at the top of the mausoleum resounded with countless mournful cries of swords, giving rise to countless strong gusts of sword wind. In that instant, it actually suppressed the hurricane that was wreaking havoc in the Garden of Zhou. Countless swords surged out from the sheath at his waist. Whoosh 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 whoosh. These swords brushed against the edge of the yellow paper umbrella and then quickly dispersed, just like a firework. The 10,000 swords turned into several dozen sword lines. They rose from the top of the mausoleum and fell into the sky, just like the ribs of an umbrella. This was a huge umbrella that covered 1,000 li. It was held up by Chen Chongqing, and held up the sky that was about to collapse. I have to write the next chapter before 9 o'clock. Chapter 350. A huge umbrella made of swords covered the sky of the Garden of Zhou. It blocked the flowing flames that fell from the sky, and supported the fragments of space that were about to shatter and fall. The fragments of the sky that were currently falling should not have had any weight, but attached to the surface of the invisible umbrella, they seemed to have infinite weight. With a light "pa" sound, Chen Chongqing's feet sunk deep into the hard rock. Numerous fine cracks appeared on the edges and his pants instantly turned into countless shreds. In the next moment, his body began to violently tremble. The unimaginable weight and pressure of the sky directly passed through the 10,000 swords to his body. Every single bone in his body seemed to creak, as if they could break at any time. The terrifying cracking sounds continued to ring out. His 2 feet continued to break through the hard rock. He could no longer support himself, and his left knee softened. Just like that, he knelt down. His knee fell heavily on the rock, smashing into countless gravel and dust. Only a series of muffled rumbles like thunder could be heard from below. Dust rose up, gradually covering the nearby grassland and the white grass path that was no longer the same as before. The entire mausoleum began to tremble, and then in an extremely short amount of time, it actually sank several feet. This was the weight of the sky. Chen Chongqing knelt on one knee at the top of the mausoleum. Under the sky, his face became paler and paler, and his expression became more and more pained. His body that had been bathed in the blood of a true dragon could be said to be as tough as steel. Even Nank's peacock plume was unable to break through his external defense. However, under this pure, terrifying weight, even if his body was made of steel, it seemed like it would still be crushed into pieces. Fortunately, it was not the real sky in the end. It was just a fragment of the sky that had been torn down by the storm of energy. Although it was extremely painful, and his soul had almost been crushed to pieces, he still managed to hold on in the end. His body gradually stopped trembling. The 11 stone pillars around the mausoleum had also truly calmed down. Some sort of qi seemed to faintly flow between the black stone tablet. If it were not for the black stone that Wang Jitsa had left behind, no matter if it was him, Su Yorong, or the human cultivators and monsters in the Garden of Zhou, none of them would be like this. At the very least, they would still have a sliver of life. He knelt at the highest point of the mausoleum. His left hand held the yellow paper umbrella, and his right hand held the dagger stabbed into the rock. He raised his head with great difficulty and gazed into the distance, hoping that the sliver of life had already arrived. The cracked sky was already very gloomy, and now it was covered by countless sword images. The world of the Garden of Zhou was even more gloomy. The collapse of the world had temporarily stopped, and the gales on the plains were still madly dancing. One could see that many monsters had already rushed to the edge of the plains, and one could also see that in the distant burning gardens, there were faintly discernible qi that was currently rushing away at high speeds. Had someone already left? Then, his line of sight passed through the madly dancing sandstorm and landed in the distance. He could vaguely see that the Pling had already flown out of the grassland with the young girl in its grasp, disappearing into the mountains on the horizon. You have to live well, he silently thought in his heart. The gate to the garden of Zhou might have already opened, and the people participating in the trial were currently leaving. Those monsters might also have escaped, but he could not leave. Once he withdrew the 10,000 swords, the sky would directly fall down, crushing him and the garden of Zhou into smoke. The gales on the plains were still violent. His knees were deeply embedded into the rocks at the highest point of the mausoleum, and he tiredly lowered his head. He felt that his situation was just like that famous tragic hero from the myths of the Orthodoxy. On the steep mountain path, the hero who used all his strength to resist the falling boulders would be crushed to death if he relaxed even a little. He could only spend his life fighting against the boulders day and night, endlessly exhausting his life in the process of resisting the boulders. Chen Chongqing had never thought that he would enter such a despairing situation. He did not want to be a tragic hero, nor did he have any thoughts of sacrificing his life for righteousness. He was not that great. It was just that he wanted to live, and he also wanted many people to live. For example, the people he knew, the people he cared about. Zhixiu, if you are still alive, then live on. Qi Jian, you should also be alive. And that elven girl who had just disappeared into the mountains, the one with the same surname and a beautiful name as him. Lady Chu Jian, you must live well. As for what he should do next? Just now, he had said to Su Yorong that he would do as he saw fit. These 3 words actually meant that he did not know what to do, but he really did want to see if the change that he was waiting for would appear. The reason why that famous tragic hero from the Orthodoxy's myths used up all of his time and life in the struggle against that boulder, until he became a stone statue out of despair, was because in that endless period of time, not a single person helped him. The reason why no one was willing to help him was because he was once very arrogant, and was never willing to help those lowly commoners. Although Chen Chongqing often made people speechless, no one would think that he was arrogant. Self-confidence and arrogance were never synonymous, and he had always been very willing to help others, such as those human cultivators that were currently fleeing out of the garden of Zhou. Those who achieve the Tao will always receive help. Important figures of the orthodoxy like Archbishop Mei Li Sha, as well as experts like the solitary drunk under the moon and Zhu Luo, were all outside the garden of Zhou. As long as he could endure for a little longer, these people would definitely come to save him. This was what Chen Chongqing thought. Only, just how long did he have to endure for? How long did he have to endure for? The terrifying weight of the sky caused pain to not a single part of his body. As time passed, the umbrella in his right hand became heavier and heavier, until his arm gradually lost feeling, as if it was crippled. After an unknown amount of time, the black dragon's voice rang out from the dagger stuck in the rock at the top of the mausoleum. Are you all right? Chen Chongqing lowered his head and asked, Are you all right? He was more concerned about its current situation. Previously, in order to resist that golden-winged great Ping, the black dragon's spiritual soul had awoken from the lake outside his ethereal palace, and then entered the dagger. After that, it actually did not have the time to communicate at all. The black dragon was silent for a while, then said, I'm all right. Chen Chongqing said, I'm also all right. I can still hold on for a little longer. The black dragon said, I can understand. This is the so-called double entendre in your human language, but you know, compared to the dragon language, this kind of technique or complexity is really unbelievably pitiful. Chen Chongqing said tiredly, Can you say something else? The black dragon said, Yes, there's something that you still don't seem to know. I'm wondering if I should tell you, Chen Chongqing said. It doesn't matter. The black dragon's voice became somewhat cautious. You won't die, right? I won't. Chen Chongqing did not even think about it, and directly answered. The black dragon was silent for a very long time, then said, "It seems that you really are going to die." Chen Chongqing felt somewhat helpless and said, "Why do you say that?" "I said I won't die." The black dragon said, "Your answer just now was too fast. You didn't take it to heart." Chen Chongqing was too lazy to pay attention to it, but he faintly felt that something was wrong. He was not surprised that the black dragon could speak the human language, but why was its voice so clear and soft, just like a girl's? He did not ask because he was currently really very tired, very painful, and almost unable to hold on any longer. This was the weight of the sky. How long could a mortal last? He did not sweat, but he felt that all the muscles in his body had already been torn apart, and he was about to lose all strength. His mind had already become somewhat dazed, and his true essence had already been exhausted. Even his vision had become a blur. The 10,000 swords were silent, and he was also silent. He had even entered a state of forgetfulness, forgetting everything. After an unknown amount of time, the whistling of the wind gradually weakened, and the pressure brought about by the violent torrents of energy gradually disappeared. The weight from the yellow paper umbrella also gradually disappeared, and the world became quiet. Chen Chongqing opened his eyes, extremely tired, and looked around. Just at this moment, a snowflake fell, landing on the surface of the yellow paper umbrella. Such a gentle snowflake, yet it made his wrist feel a sharp pain, and he almost lost his grip on the umbrella. The garden of Zhou was snowing? No. This was not the garden of Zhou, this was a snowy plain. He looked into the distance, and under the shadow of the sky, he could faintly see a majestic city. Where was this? He was very confused, and did not know what had happened. Shock and exhaustion made it impossible for him to move, and he still maintained his previous posture. He knelt on one knee in the snowy plain, his left hand holding the dagger, and his right hand holding the yellow paper umbrella. The sky here had not collapsed, and the snowy plain was beautiful. His current posture was obviously somewhat laughable. The sound of footsteps rang out, and a person walked to his side. With a light sound of surprise, he said, "There's a sword." Then that person extended his hand and took the yellow paper umbrella from Chen Chongqing's hand. The plot of the Garden of Zhou has officially come to an end. Of course, there are still many aftershocks, and the interesting things that everyone wants to see are all at the end. I personally like the plot of the Garden of Zhou very much. That was something that was confirmed in advance last year, and I wrote it very earnestly and diligently, but when the plot of the Garden of Zhou was interrupted, I began to imagine today's chapter in advance. What I wanted was that final scene. I've seriously studied this scene many times with my friends in real life. I've played the scene of Chen Chongqing half kneeling on the snowy plain to deliver the umbrella, and I've also played the scene of a certain pretentious person elegantly taking the umbrella. In short, this scene is the goal of my writing. When I write novels and make up stories, it's always for the sake of countless beautiful scenes. For example, at the Spring Breeze Pavilion at night, when my eldest brother enters the stage in black and white, he also makes a light sound of surprise, and so on. As the saying goes, I won't change even if you beat me to death. That's me. I hope everyone likes it. The Golden Keyboard Awards will be held at the end of the month, so I'll have to trouble everyone to cast a free vote for Heaven's chosen work. Many thanks.